After that, authors David Broder and Haynes Johnson discussed their recent book, The System. Later, a joint news conference by President Clinton and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, and a speech by California Congressman Sonny Bono. At 4:25, the balanced budget bill and the Internet. Then the fiscal condition of U.S. cities, followed by the discussion on the re-election campaign of Boris Yeltsin, and authors David Broder and Haynes Johnson. Tomorrow at 8, live coverage of a breakfast meeting with New York Senator Alphonse D'Amato at the Gannett News Service. And at 11, live coverage of the U.S. Senate. Members will vote on a defense spending bill and continue debate on a workplace issues bill. Next, a hearing on the June 25th bombing of U.S. military facilities in Saudi Arabia. Today, the Senate Armed Services Committee heard testimony from Defense Secretary William Perry and Joint Chiefs of Staff Chairman General John Shalikashvili. Republican Senator Strom Thurmond chaired this 3-hour hearing.
The committee will come to order. The Committee on Armed Services convenes this morning to conduct a hearing on the circumstances and consequences of a terrorist bomb attack on the Hobart Towers in Dhahran, Saudi Arabia on June 25, 1996. The bomb attack resulted in the deaths of 19 U.S. military servicemen and injuries to approximately 550 others, including 250 Americans. I'd like to express my deepest condolences on behalf of the Committee on Armed Services to the families of our servicemen who lost their lives in the terrorist bomb attack in Saudi Arabia on June 25th. American servicemen and women sacrifice a great deal in volunteering to serve their country, especially when they deploy for extended tours overseas. Members of the committee and the nation are extremely proud of our personnel in uniform. Our sincerest sympathies are extended to the beloved ones of those who sacrificed their lives, as well as those injured during the bomb attack. The American people, the administration, and the Congress are obligated to provide the very best security and support for those in our armed forces who volunteer to stand in harm's way. We must do all in our power to provide for the continuous readiness and protection of our men and women in uniform as they serve our nation on dangerous missions in an increasingly volatile world. Occurring on the 46th anniversary of the North Korean invasion of South Korea, this most recent terrorist attack on our troops stands as a stark reminder that the United States must maintain a strong military that is prepared to meet and defeat a wide spectrum of threats to our vital and important interests. We must remain vigilant. The purpose of this hearing is for the committee to determine the facts surrounding the bomb attack, including the extent to which it was recognized that U.S. military personnel housed in the Hobart Towers were vulnerable to a terrorist attack, the degree to which any concerns relating to such an attack were made known to up the chain of command, the measures that were taken to meet the threats that were identified, and why safeguards that might have thwarted such an attack or minimized casualties were not in place. The committee will review decisions made with respect to these threats and concerns by both U.S. and Saudi authorities. In addition, the committee is interested in the state of security for other U.S. forces posted in regions where they might be vulnerable to similar attacks. I'd like to add that I have always believed that those issues affecting the security of our nation should be handled here in the Congress in a bipartisan manner. Since I have been chairman of the committee, I have insisted that the committee operate in this way. I do want to make clear, however, that the protection of our men and women in uniform is a responsibility that rests with the leadership, both civilian and military, from the president down, and must be taken with the utmost seriousness. I intend that this committee will determine if lapses have occurred in carrying out these responsibilities and will recommend strong action where appropriate. Our witnesses today are Secretary of Defense William Perry, General John Casciaville, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and General J.H. Benford P. III, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Central Command, whose area of responsibility includes the Middle East. The committee expects these witnesses to provide information that will assist us in reaching a full understanding of how this tragic event occurred. We must learn what we can from this latest incident and then do what we must to prevent a recurrence. The witnesses are well known to this committee, each having testified before us on numerous occasions and requires no introduction. I want to the witnesses, I want to extend to each of you a welcome and on behalf of the committee, and we look forward to your testimony. Because of the limited time and substantial interest in this sharing by all members of the committee, I request that each of you limit your oral statements to 7 minutes or less. Now, to members and witnesses, finally, before we begin, I would like to remind the members and witnesses that immediately after this open hearing, the committee will conduct a closed session with the witnesses in room S407. We're very pleased to have you with us. The distinguished senator from Maine, I believe, is in Egypt and could not be here, but he's very interested in this matter, and he wanted to express his, have me to express his interest to all the committee about this. He's interested over there in the fight against terrorism, peace process, and related security, and political and economic issues. Before he left for Cairo, he was briefed on the investigation of the recent bombing in Saudi Arabia, and he may submit some questions for the record for today's witnesses. Now, Secretary Perry, we'll begin with you. Oh, excuse me. The ranking member may have a statement to make, but you can't make a statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I want to commend you for scheduling the hearing. I realize that our witnesses, Secretary of Defense Perry and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Saakashvili, and Commander-in-Chief of U.S. Central Command, General P., will only be able to provide preliminary information at this point, but it will be helpful to us to have whatever they know at this point. More complete information will await the outcome of the assessment being performed by retired General Wayne Downing and other investigations being conducted into the bombing incident. But I believe it's very important to begin our oversight effort now to ascertain what happened and what steps should be taken in the future. As you have said, Mr. Chairman, that is most important. I want to join you, Mr. Chairman, in expressing my deep condolences to the families of the fine Americans who lost their lives and my heartfelt wishes for a speedy and full recovery by those American airmen and the personnel of our allies who were injured. This incident underscores the fact that U.S. servicemen and women are in harm's way every day as they perform their missions at home and abroad. I want to commend Secretary Perry for appointing retired General Wayne Downing to conduct an assessment of the facts and circumstances surrounding this bombing, the extent to which it was the result of inadequate security, infrastructure, policies, or systems, and to recommend measures to minimize casualties and damage from such attacks in the future. In order to fully understand the circumstances surrounding this tragic incident, we must ascertain the answers to a number of questions, as many as we can this morning, but certainly in the course of this overall investigation, including the following. What recommendations to improve security came out of the assessments performed after the November 1995 bombing in Saudi Arabia? Which of these were carried out, which were not, and to the extent they were not, why not? was an assumption made that militants in Saudi Arabia did not have the ability or expertise to explode a bomb any larger than the 200-pound device used in November 1995 attack, and if so, why? Where did these assumptions come from? Were they based on intelligence? Were they based on analysis? Was this simply based on what had happened in the past without regard to any real analytical forecast? Another question was human intelligence and other intelligence support on the scene to the commander effective? If not, why not? Another question, did Saudi officials turn down a request to extend the perimeter at Khobar Towers facility, and was this decision appealed up to the chain of command? What did Washington officials know about that request, and when did they find out about it? What action was taken? Did the changes brought about by the 1986 Goldwater-Nichols legislation streamline the chain of command and facilitate the oversight responsibilities of the Commander-in-Chief Central Command? That's particularly pertinent given the history of the Lebanon chain of command, which was very cumbersome, very difficult, and probably had something to do with the tragedy in Lebanon a few years ago. Did Saudi officials cooperate fully in the aftermath of the November 1995 bombing, and are they cooperating fully at this time? And finally, have the Gulf states themselves taken sufficient action in the aftermath of the Gulf War to improve their own ability to defend themselves? Should the United States be both the residual backup and also the primary frontline support for the defense of the Persian Gulf? Are we going to play all roles, or should the primary role be played by the Gulf states themselves, with us being the backup, which was the assumption that many of us had after the Persian Gulf War? In fact, I think that was our policy. If that was our policy, is that policy still applicable, or has it in effect been dropped with us assuming all the roles in the defense of the Persian Gulf? Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the opportunity to hear from our witnesses this morning. We appreciate Secretary Perry and General Shalikashvili and General P being here. And again, I thank you for having this hearing in a timely fashion.
Secretary Perry, you may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The U.S. military is a family. We have just lost 19 members of our family, and we feel their loss deeply.
Speak in your loudspeaker, please. This is a long room, and people can't hear you back there.
We have just lost 19 members of our family, and we feel their loss deeply. But we must carry on the mission they were conducting. And we must learn from this tragic event and establish measures to provide better protection for our forces. There is no issue that I feel more deeply about, or no task that I work harder at, than the safety and welfare of our military personnel. In pursuing that task, I have always had the full support of this committee, and I welcome the opportunity to discuss force protection with you today. In February of '94, when I came before you for confirmation, I said, the Secretary of Defense has the responsibility to oversee the Joint Staff and the SINCs in their direction of military operations. If I am confirmed as Secretary, I pledge to give first priority to reviewing and assessing war plans and deployment orders, and I pledge to provide the required support to SINCs as they direct our force in the field. You did confirm me, and to the best of my ability, I have carried out the promise that I made to you and to the American people. A critically important component in the oversight of military operations is ensuring appropriate force protection. The responsibility for the safety of our military men and women is mine, and I expect to be held accountable for carrying out that responsibility. I carry out the responsibility for the safety of our military personnel in 4 ways. First of all, by making judgments on whether the missions that we assign our military personnel are worth the risk of casualties. I manifest this responsibility every time I sign a deployment order. Secondly, by judging the competence of our senior commanders, especially those who lead our unified commands. The 4-star generals and admirals whom I recommend to the President and you confirm for leadership of our deployed forces. Thirdly, by making clear policy statements regarding the priority of our missions. In particular, I sign off on each mission statement, which includes the policy on force protection for that mission. And fourth, by visiting our forces in the field to make judgments how our commanders are executing their missions, with special emphasis on force protection. In my testimony today, I will describe in more detail how I carry out these four responsibilities and specifically how they apply to protection of our forces in Saudi Arabia. My first responsibility, then, is to decide whether a proposed mission is worth the risk of American lives. No responsibility weighs more heavily with me. I have articulated to you on numerous occasions my belief that when our vital national interests are at stake, we must be prepared to use military force, even at the risk of casualties. While such a judgment may be thought of as a risk-benefit analysis, for me, it is much more personal. I make such judgments every week when I sign operational deployment orders. I made such a judgment when I deployed our forces to Bosnia in the face of forecasts that our forces would be met with fierce armed resistance. I made such a judgment after the bombing of the Saudi National Guard facility in Riyadh when I reconfirmed that the mission our forces carry out in the Gulf region is in our vital national interest. This reconfirmation should come as no surprise to this committee. In every statement I have made on the subject, I have made clear my belief that the security and stability of the Gulf region ranks as a vital national interest to the United States. The Gulf, of course, is the world's energy storehouse, home to two-thirds of the globe's proven oil reserves. At the same time, it is a volatile region. It is the reason we fought in Desert Storm, and the reason in October of 1944 when we sent forces to deter Saddam's threatened aggression. Because the Gulf region is so important to us and because it is so volatile, we have developed a several-part strategy to preserve the security and stability of the region. Let me summarize that for you. We maintain a significant military presence in the region, including air power at host national bases and naval power on our ships in the Gulf and the Arabian Sea. We maintain pre-positioned equipment in the region, a brigade's worth of heavy armor in Kuwait, another brigade's worth of equipment afloat, and an additional brigade's worth of equipment going into Qatar. We maintain lift capability that can get our forces to the Gulf quickly if needed, and we maintain access agreements with the countries in the region, and we regularly train with them to help build up their own capabilities. The keystone in this strategy is our military presence, which serves as a deterrence to rogue nations by reminding them that the U.S. will fight to defend our vital interests in the region. If deterrence fails, then our military presence becomes the base on which we quickly build our fighting force, thereby ensuring a rapid military victory with minimum casualties. For these reasons, then, I believe that our military presence in the region is essential to protect our vital national interests and to carry out our strategy. We must not allow ourselves to be driven out by terrorists. The second way I carry out my responsibility for the safety of our personnel is to make judgments about who is best qualified to lead our military force. The chairman is the key military advisor to me and to the president. I have enormous confidence in General Shalikashvili, and this judgment led me to recommend him for reappointment to a second term as chairman. The commanders-in-chiefs of the unified commands are the key leaders who direct our troops in combat and in the daily operations that are most likely to lead them in harm's way. I made another judgment about military leadership when I recommended our current commander-in-chief of the Central Command, General Benny P., for his position. The commander of the 101st Airborne Division in Desert Storm, a veteran of 2 tours in Vietnam, General P. probably has more combat command experience than any Army officer currently on active duty. He is a warfighter, a strategist, and a diplomat. Our nation is fortunate to have a military leader of his ability in such a critical position. The third way I carry out my responsibility for the safety of our personnel is by setting clear policy direction. That is the role of civilian leadership. We then rely on the military experts to take the concrete steps to carry out these policies. One of the missions for all of our operations is force protection. Every military plan must make this a priority. It is an inherent part of every operation and a basic responsibility of our commanders. Whether for training or operational deployments, commanders issue clear guidance on force protection and specify the applicable rules of engagement for each situation. When troops are in any operation involving risk of combat or high threat from terrorism, force protection becomes critical and complex. Some critics scoff at the stringent rules by which we protect our forces in Bosnia. We have one full company assigned to guard duty for each battalion, convoys of 4 vehicles minimum, no alcohol consumption while in theater, flak jackets, helmets, and weapons when outside secure compounds. I gave the order that I wanted the force protection to be a priority, and Major General Nash determined that in his operating environment, these would be the rules. I reviewed those rules when I visited him last week, and I fully support his decision to maintain such stringent measures. Our operations in Saudi Arabia take place in a uniquely difficult environment. Our pilots, of course, face daily risks over Iraq and must operate at peak performance. Our personnel using Saudi facilities may not face mines, but they do face a severe threat from terrorism. Terrorists always strike at the weak link in our chain of defenses. Our goal must be to try to find and strengthen those weak spots first, with what I call passive defenses, guards, barriers, fences. But passive measures are not enough. We must also increase our active defenses by getting better at gathering intelligence so that we can preempt or disrupt terrorist operations before they can come to fruition. We must also work cooperatively with other governments, in this case, the Saudis. After I visited with our troops in Dhahran last week, I flew with General P to Jeddah, where we met with Minister of Defense Sultan, who pledged his full cooperation and determination to find and punish the perpetrators. I then met with King Fahad, along with Crown Prince Abdullah, Minister of Defense Sultan, Minister of Interior Naif, and Foreign Minister Saud. I would note that we were the first official Americans to meet with the King since his illness last November. I know many of you have read media accounts about the state of the King's health. I can only tell you what I observed. The King was fully in control of the meeting. He met with me late in the evening for more than an hour, and then followed that with a meeting with his senior officials for an additional 2 hours. In addition to expressing deep sympathy at our loss, he made absolutely clear his determination to bring the perpetrators to justice. Excuse me. And he directed that there be full cooperation between the Saudi and U.S. investigators. I then explained to the Saudi leadership our assessment of how serious the threat was and the importance of making significant changes in the security measures for our forces, including the need for rebasing. The fourth way I carry out my responsibility for the safety of our personnel is by getting out to the field and visiting with troops and commanders. Through this practice, I get the confidence I need to make decisions that put people at risk. I made 3 trips to Haiti during that operation. I have visited with our troops in Bosnia 4 times already, including once during their train-up period. I was with them just after they bridged the Sava River, and I just returned from a visit with them over the 4th of July. I can report that they understand their mission and that they are accomplishing it brilliantly. I have made 4 trips to the Gulf region, stopping each time in Saudi Arabia to visit with our forces and with the political leaders. My 3rd trip, in early January of this year, gave me the opportunity to make a first-hand assessment following the bombing at the Saudi National Guard facility. During that visit, I re-emphasized that the first priority must be force protection, and I reviewed the security enhancements that have been made for our forces in Riyadh. I also reevaluated the mission of our forces in the region, the risks, the costs, and the impact on operational tempo against the goals and benefit. After my visit to the theater that time, I made a follow-up trip to CENTCOM headquarters to review progress on the actions resulting from that visit. Last week, I went to Saudi Arabia to see for myself the results of the attack, to determine how we should respond to it, and to learn firsthand how our people had reacted. I found the troops sobered by the events of the preceding days, but their morale was strong. They clearly understood the importance of their mission and the role they fulfill in this important endeavor. Even amidst the tragedy, we can take pride in the performance of our military personnel in the critical moments before, during, and after the attack. This is a classic case of training paying off. The guards on top of the building spotted the truck, recognized the danger, and immediately radioed an alarm. Undoubtedly, some lives were saved by the alertness and quick reactions of the guards. A patrol and a Humvee responded to the alarm, and a security policeman arrived on the scene in time to warn away 4 or more joggers. He then went himself to investigate the truck and only survived the blast because it was deflected into the air by the barrier wall. Training also paid off in how everyone behaved after the blast. 19 airmen, of course, were killed in the blast, but 200 more were injured, seriously enough to visit a clinic for treatment. Everyone arrived at the clinic, accompanied by a buddy. All the troops have had some basic medical training, and the doctors reported to me that everyone who arrived at the clinic had had some emergency medical buddy care. So on this score, I'm also satisfied. Our commanders have trained the troops well, and they knew how to react in a crisis. The mood of our troops was anger and determination. Anger in that they want the perpetrators found and severely punished. Determination in that they want to prove that they will not be deflected from their mission. By the time that I arrived, 4 days after the attack, they had already restored the full operating tempo. Operation Southern Watch hardly missed a beat, and the no-fly zone below the 32nd parallel is in full force. What can we learn from this tragedy? What went right? What went wrong? What should we do differently in the future? I have asked General Wayne Downing to make an independent assessment of the circumstances surrounding the bombing, and I expect to be able to give you a complete answer to these questions when General Downing's assessment is completed next month. But based on what I've already learned, I can give you a partial answer. The mission of our forces was clearly understood and recognized to be of vital importance. The chain of command was clear. There was a clear recognition at all levels of command that we faced a high level of threat from terrorists. Much had already been done to improve the physical security at Khobar Towers. But the security measures we prescribed after the bombing of the Saudi National Guard facility were focused on a threat less powerful than actually occurred. And our local commanders, for a variety of reasons, had not completed some of the measures that were prescribed and which they agreed needed to be done. Why did we focus on a threat which proved to be understated? For the decades of American presence there, it seemed that Saudi Arabia was safe from the terrorist violence occurring in other countries in the Middle East. During the 5 years since Desert Storm, we have maintained an increased military presence, but the security provisions for the residents and offices of our personnel were roughly comparable to those for the forces based in Germany or Japan. Yet we know that the mission we are conducting in Saudi Arabia, so vital to us, is opposed by others. Certainly it is opposed by Iran and Iraq, since our forces in the region deter them from actions they might otherwise take. And our very presence in Saudi Arabia is opposed by some religious extremists in that country, some of whom are willing to use violent measures to drive us out. In November of last year, a group of Saudi religious extremists attacked the office of the U.S. program manager for the Saudi National Guard in Riyadh with a car bomb, killing 5 Americans. At that point, we made what we believed to be a prudent judgment that this attack might not be an isolated event, but a new trend, and thus assigned a high terrorist threat level to Saudi Arabia. In response to this judgment, we conducted analyses of the vulnerability of our forces in Saudi Arabia. In particular, the Air Force's Office of Special Investigations conducted a vulnerability analysis of the Khobar Towers that was completed in January of this year. It was informed by full access to intelligence on the terrorist threat to Saudi Arabia. But the intelligence information, while voluminous and while pointing to a high threat level, was also fragmentary and inconclusive. It did not provide the user with any specific threat, but rather laid out a wide variety of threat alternatives. Consequently, our commanders received recommendations to take a variety of actions. Many actions, indeed, were completed prior to the June attack. Some focused on preventing an attack similar to the November bombing. Other actions focused on preventing attacks of a completely different nature, and indeed may have prevented a different type of attack from taking place. My assessment is that our commanders were trying to do right, but given the inconclusive nature of the intelligence, had a difficult task to know specifically what to plan for, and many of the protective measures they took were more appropriate for the size of the bomb used in November. But this attack turned out to be 10 times as powerful as the previous attack. It is evident from what is already known about the attack that the bombers were well organized, had sophisticated training, did extensive practice, and had access to military-quality explosives and detonating devices. Of course, the investigation is still underway, but it is my working assumption that these bombers had extensive support from an experienced and well-financed international terrorist organization. Therefore, based on that assumption, I believe that it is prudent to conclude that we are now facing a significantly higher and more sophisticated threat than we faced in the bombing of the Saudi National Guard facility in Riyadh. Why were the recommended security measures not yet completed at the time of the attack? Based on his view of the threat and the vulnerability analysis done by the Office of Special Investigations, the base commander undertook an extensive set of security measures at Khobar Towers. General P will describe those to you in his testimony. Some of these measures were still in progress, but most of them had been accomplished at the time the attack was made on Khobar Towers. Indeed, the security measures that were already in place undoubtedly saved dozens, if not hundreds, of lives. However, it is also undoubtedly true that significantly fewer casualties would have occurred if all of the prescribed security measures had been implemented by the time of the attack. General Downing's investigation will shed more light on why some of the recommended measures had not yet been completed. But it seems clear that local commanders would have put a higher priority on...
Secretary,
Yes.
we announced that we would have 7 minutes and the full statements would go on the record. Can you finish up pretty quick so the senators have a chance to ask questions?
Of course, Mr. Chairman. What can we do to respond to the threat? General Downing will make a complete assessment and recommendations on this, but even before I receive his assessment, I can tell you that the changes required to deal with this level of threat will be complex, expensive, and take many months to implement. It is fundamentally difficult to provide protection against such a threat, particularly in an urban environment, and therefore I have instructed General P to include in his recommendations a plan to move our military forces out of Riyadh and other urban environments where it is difficult to provide adequate physical security. Let me skip to the end. And submit the rest of my talk for the record here, but I want to sum up as follows. First, the Khobar Towers bombing was a tragedy that revealed vulnerabilities in the force protection measures we had taken. Second, we can expect further attacks on our facilities in the command. Therefore, we are undertaking a major program to improve our force protection measures throughout the command. This will include plans to rebase our forces that are now located in urban areas. Third, we must capture and punish the bombers. And if we identify another nation as the source of the bombing, we should retaliate. And fourth, we must not let the bombers drive us out of the Gulf region. The mission we are conducting there is vital to the security interest of the United States. I'd now like to turn the microphone over to General Shalikashvili.
I want to repeat again that the full statement of the witnesses, entire statement, will go in the record. And we ask the witnesses to limit their oral statements to 7 minutes. We have a long hearing here, and the senators have questions they wish to propound. General, you may proceed.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Let me begin by once again expressing my sympathies to the families of those who lost their lives in this tragedy that we're here to discuss, and to wish a very speedy recovery to those who were wounded in this incident. Mr. Chairman, in the past 18 months, the terrorist threat in the Persian Gulf region has gone from a relatively low level to a very high level today. Thus, it is now a much more difficult challenge that we face, one where we must balance risks to our vital national interests along with these heightened risks to our forces. But balancing risks is an integral part of my job. As the principal military advisor to the Secretary of Defense and to the President, I direct strategic planning, monitor contingency operations, and assist the President and the Secretary in providing strategic direction to our forces. Out of all of my responsibilities, nothing is more important to me than to properly formulate military missions and shape military forces whenever our men and women have to be asked to go in harm's way, and at the same time, to ensure that we continue to look for better ways to protect our forces in the execution of the many and varied missions here and abroad. Force protection, safeguarding the health, safety, and physical security of our men and women in uniform and their families, is a key concern each time I recommend a plan for approval or bring an operational deployment order to the Secretary for his signature. That was true when we sent our forces to Haiti, and it is, as Secretary Perry already mentioned, why we wear Kevlar helmets and flak vests in the summer's heat in Bosnia. Details related to force protection, from special training to rules of engagement to operating procedures, are always a top priority. Whether we are conducting a non-combatant evacuation in Liberia, as we just recently did, or operating out of Saudi Arabia to deter Saddam Hussein. During my trip to the Gulf in late May of this year, I found awareness of the terrorist threat and an appreciation of the importance of force protection to be high throughout the region. Given the expected threat, I found that all of the units that I visited had implemented extensive force protection measures, both in terms of physical protection and in terms of anti-terrorism education and training. Because actions to deter terrorists must be continuous, and we must never be satisfied that we have done enough, additional measures were in the works to make security even better. Less than a month before the bombing, I talked at King Abdulaziz Air Base in Dhahran with some of the very same airmen who lived in Aqaba Towers. They were, like all of our young servicemen and women I visited around the world, a most impressive group with high morale and a sense that what they were doing was important to our nation and very much in the interest of peace and security. Indeed, the ones I talked with knew theirs was a vital mission. They knew that the 4404th Composite Wing was there flying daily missions over Iraq to deter Saddam Hussein. And they understood as well that if they were not there, that one day we might again have to fight to defend our interests and our national and our regional allies, and most likely do so at great expense to American treasure and American lives. These members of the 44th 4th Composite Wing, with whom I spoke, also understood terrorism and the need for constant vigilance. And I'm certain they knew that the terrorist threat was real. While all of our forces worldwide are sensitive to terrorism, those in Saudi Arabia were especially alert, particularly after the November 1995 car bombing at the building called OPM Sang. This tragic incident was the first such loss of American lives since Desert Storm. Suddenly, we faced a different threat in Saudi Arabia, and we had to redouble our efforts to increase our defenses. And so, first as an immediate measure, the Secretary directed on 14 November, the day after the OPM Sang bombing, that all DoD activities at home and abroad review their physical security and anti-terrorism procedures. The purpose of this review was not only to heighten our current security awareness and security posture, but to establish as well a long-term mindset that would help reduce the chances of a terrorist attack against U.S. personnel and facilities in the future. And while the regional commanders proceeded with their reviews, the Secretary and I formed the DoD Anti-Terrorism Task Force, and as part of this effort, we dispatch a general officer-level team to every overseas unified command to assess security needs and anti-terrorism practices, with a special emphasis on high-threat areas. This task force aimed to develop policy recommendations that would strengthen DoD's anti-terrorism efforts. Last month, the Secretary approved the findings of the task force, and work has begun on its recommendations. Additionally, since OPM Sang falls under the authority of the U.S. Ambassador to Saudi Arabia, we participated as well at general officer level in the State Department's Accountability Review Board, whose purpose was to examine the security-related specific aspects of the OPM Sang bombing and to report its findings and recommendations. We are continuing to work hand in hand with the State Department in implementing the recommendations of their report. And of course, today, we are giving General Downing's review of the circumstances surrounding the Kobar Tower bombing every measure of our support. And it's important to note here that General P himself had asked for this outside review. But given the ubiquitous and ever-changing nature of terrorism, anti-terrorism must be a continuous process. We can always improve, and we will never stop trying. However, in the future, we must face one hard fact. We will have more terrorist incidents. Terrorism will always seek the weak link and take the most indirect approach to its ends. It will make every effort to strike at the seams, seeking shock effect and publicity over military utility. Terrorists will continue to be patient as they are destructive. No one, not even the Israelis, who have more experience than any other people in dealing with terrorism, has figured out a way to decisively defeat it in the near term. Yet in the areas where our interests are great, we must accept that risk, while at the same time continuing to work consistently and methodically to reduce the risk to our men and women in uniform. The Downing assessment is another step in that continuous process. But in the end, we cannot let acts of terrorism deter us from pursuing our vital interests. That said, with your permission, Mr. Chairman, I would now like to ask General P to outline for you his perspective, his command's actions in connection with this tragic event, and his efforts to minimize the risks of terrorism to the forces of Central Command.
General P.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Let me begin by expressing, on behalf of all servicemen and women assigned to U.S. Central Command, my deepest condolence to the loved ones of our comrades in arms killed and wounded. While no words can adequately console our families during this tragic time, we can take comfort in remembering that these young Americans were struck down while heroically serving our nation. Accomplishing our missions in the region in general, and in Saudi Arabia in particular, means achieving success in a very complex operational environment. The first part involves understanding the Saudi culture and the way of doing business. The second part involves the dynamics of managing operational risk. Our relationship with the Saudis is based on promoting mutual interest. We are not colonizing their country. We do not seek to infringe on their culture. We respect their way of life. But we do not intentionally allow these efforts to endanger our servicemen and women. Over the last several decades, our government has considered Saudi Arabia one of the safest countries in the world. Over 40,000 American civilians live and work in Saudi Arabia this morning. What's more, the U.S. military enjoys a close relationship with Saudi counterparts that is the envy of nations throughout the world. What may appear as Saudi indifference or unwillingness to act on an issue is in fact a reflection of their different sense of time. Similarly, what may appear as foot-dragging by various levels of government is often a reflection of the compartmentalized nature of Saudi bureaucracy and decision-making. Decisions at all levels of the Saudi government are slow by U.S. standards and are often reached by consensus. In addition, the King's role as custodian of the two holy mosques produces intense Saudi sensitivity to issues involving their sovereignty. Our sensitivity to these dynamics produces a friendship and internal stability supportive of our national interest. Another aspect of the operational climate that must be understood is the manner in which I, as a theater commander, and my subordinate commanders manage operational risk. Our relatively small forward presence reflects our recognition that local societies can be easily oversaturated, producing the very instability that we seek to prevent. The terrorist attack on Khobar Towers reflects the changing nature of the terrorist threat in Saudi Arabia. Though some have attempted to compare this bombing with the suicide attack on the U.S. Marine barracks in Beirut in 1983, the differences are simply striking. Saudi Arabia is a viable, prosperous, stable country. Prior to the bombing of OPM Sang last year, there were very few terrorist incidents directed against Americans within the kingdom. It is not in the grips of a civil war. It does not suffer the destruction and chaos associated with a multitude of warring extremist groups. It is not caught in the middle of a conflict between warring nations, such as was Lebanon with respect to Syria and Israel. U.S. forces are not engaged in active combat actions against local military groups, as was the United States in Lebanon, where Marines were employing small arms, artillery, naval gunfire, and airstrikes against the Druze and Amal-Shiite militiamen. We recognize, however, that Middle Eastern terrorism has evolved over the years. There are several groups operating within our area of responsibility and interest, groups like the Hamas, Hezbollah, Al-Jihad, most receiving financing, weapons, and sanctuary from countries like Iran and Sudan. We are seeing a growth in transnational groups comprised of Islamic extremists, many of whom fought in Afghanistan and now drift to other countries with the aim of establishing anti-Western, fundamentalist regimes by destabilizing traditional governments through attacks on the United States and Western targets. Their small cellular structure and tendency to operate independently of state sponsors complicate detection of their activities. We also are sensitive to the emergence of the last few years of anti-Saudi government groups, but the direct relationship of such groups with transnational terrorist cells remains unclear. Let me suggest these initial thoughts on the terrorist attack on Khobar Towers. First, Central Command and subordinate commands competently fulfill their intelligence analysis, collection, and dissemination responsibilities prior to the Khobar Towers bombing. CENTCOM, its subordinate commands, and the interagency conduct thorough intelligence work 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. I personally review key intelligence information on all threats to include the terrorist threat every day, 7 days a week. The same information is shared with all senior commanders, to include those in Saudi Arabia. Difficulties arise in detecting specific acts of terror before they occur. The terrorist is a criminal. The terrorist is not a soldier. He strikes indiscriminately at the target of his choosing, with any means, at any times. All targets are legitimate in his eyes. He seeks to inflict as much damage as possible, to horrify and shock the local population and global audience and to embarrass the leaders of a country. Under the circumstances, there is no way to achieve absolute security for our military people or our citizens living abroad. An initial review of the intelligence relating specifically to Saudi Arabia and Khobar Towers in the months prior to Khobar Tower bombing reveals an increase in suspected surveillance, but no clear indication of an impending major terrorist attack. Second, Central Command, its component commands, and other U.S. military organizations in the Kingdom have competently accomplished their missions and command responsibilities prior and subsequent to the OPM Sang and Khobar Towers bombing. November 1995 OPM Sang bombing was a watershed, demarcating a new escalation in the terrorist threat. Soon after the bombing, I met with our ambassadors in the region, including those in Egypt, Kuwait, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, UAE, and Pakistan, to discuss shared secured responsibilities. Concurrently, I met with all of my senior component commanders and with senior U.S. military leaders in regional countries to review the terrorist threat, the chain of command responsibilities, and legal and military force protection requirements. Subordinate commanders use these meetings to share their concerns on force protection and to brainstorm additional safeguards. In addition, I raised the threat from medium to high and directed a theater-wide reassessment of security of our facilities in the region. Force protection is complicated because each country in the region confronts different types of threats and reflects unique internal political and social conditions. What's more, urbanization, road networks, availability of facilities, and time associated with completing all security precautions affects the speed with which we have completed security upgrades theater-wide. Nevertheless, Central Command and its component commanders initiated a series of security-related inspections throughout the region, a daunting task when you consider that I am responsible for over 50 military facilities, large facilities, and sites for combatants in the region, and between the chiefs of mission and myself, hundreds and hundreds of facilities and housing areas for military non-combatants. We have completed 50 assessments since January 1996, assessments that have led to further security enhancements. As in the case with any military defense, we are always improving our positions, continually collecting and analyzing intelligence, replacing sandbags, enhancing perimeters, installing improved sensors, early warning devices, deploying ground dogs, guard dogs, positioning machine guns, and increasing guards and patrols. Consequently, what we observe at a time of a terrorist attack is a snapshot of the status of a facility at the time of attack. And I think this was somewhat true at Khobar Towers on 25 June 1996. Third, Commanders JTF SWA, Joint Southwest Asia, and 4404th Wing Provisional responded with appropriate actions commensurate with the existing terrorist threat prior to the bombing. During November 1995 and April 1996, the local military commanders responded to the OPM Sang bombing by reassessing the security of Khobar Towers. They raised their own local threat conditions as different from my threat warning, setting into motion more stringent force protection measures designed to contend with various types of terrorist strikes, to include a car bomb. Enhancements included upgraded fences, adding additional concrete barriers along access roads, establishing a single well-defended exit and entry point, clearing fields of view along perimeters, denying vehicles access to garages, blocking service roads between buildings, establishing no parking areas near buildings, increasing U.S. patrols and guards, requesting and receiving additional Saudi guards and patrols, inspecting all mails and parcels, deliveries, and augmenting their staffs with physical security agents. Suspicious security-related incidents in early spring caused local commanders to enact even more rigorous security measures commencing 1 April 1996. These included adding more concrete barriers along the fence line, boosting standoff along perimeter fences, increasing Saudi patrols, getting the local police to check license plate numbers of suspicious vehicles, and positioning a manned sand-filled dump truck to block the entrance in emergency. To summarize, the local commanders implemented over 130 security improvements at Khobar Towers between November 1995 95, and June 1996. And I can tell you, in talking with Norm Schwarzkopf several times, the facility today, at the time of the bombing, was in considerably greater protection than it was throughout the Gulf War. Fourth and lastly, our servicemen and women at Khobar Towers performed magnificently prior to and subsequent to the terrorist attack. Prior to the attack, they labored in 115-degree heat to erect protective measures. Guards overcame the drudgery of their duty to maintain vigilant 24 hours a day, and leaders continued to press for additional security measures up until the time of attack. In the aftermath of the explosion, as the Secretary has related, our people performed flawlessly in evacuating our wounded, performing triage and first aid, providing advanced medical care, evacuating buildings, and as the smoke cleared in the morning of 26 June, our men and women continued their mission. Pilots prepared to launch the air operations over southern Iraq. The Patriot batteries remained steady, and security personnel began to improve their positions. In conclusion, when I arrived at Khobar Towers several days after the bombing, I was struck by the dedication and the selflessness of our people, their courageous effort to deal with grief of losing friends, their ability to overcome the confusion to continue their operational missions. I was impressed with the work done by the commander of the 4404th, Brigadier General Chalier, for it was this commander who had to deal with the immediate crisis, take care of the wounded and the dead, reorganize his security, coordinate with the Saudis, keep our headquarters informed, and provide information to the media. It's easy to forget that his responsibilities extended beyond security at Khobar Towers. While he had a staff and subordinate commanders to assist him, he was nevertheless responsible for air operations in Iraq and in the Gulf. He had people living and working on 11 different sites in Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Jordan, Oman, Qatar, and the UAE, and he had been aggressive over the last months in upgrading security in all of these sites. Even with the additional physical security upgrades, we should recognize that we remain vulnerable to terrorist attacks. I don't believe that any amount of money or physical security upgrade alone can stop a determined terrorist. While terrorism has been a threat to our country for many years, it is evolving, and it is growing increasingly more sophisticated. We must keep in mind it is both a criminal act and a way of war, and our servicemen and women are on the front line of terrorism throughout the Gulf. We mourn for fallen comrades. It is the heart-wrenching part of the profession of arms. Some forget that placing our servicemen and women in harm's way around the world involves risk. And while the American people have every right to demand competence, character, and leadership from our military commanders, they should not expect zero defects. Demanding such a rigid standard produces timid leaders, afraid to make tough decisions in crisis, unwilling to take the risks necessary for success in military operations. And it's this zero defect mindset that creates conditions that will lead inevitably, in the larger sense, to failure in larger battle and perhaps even higher casualties. Our nation has vital interest in the Middle East and the Gulf. The recent terrorist attack does not change that reality. We cannot withdraw, for doing so would reward terrorists and endanger our nation. We must remain engaged in the region, take the actions to ensure the safety of our servicemen and women abroad, and focus on accomplishing our mission. Thank you very much, sir.
Each senator will now have 7 minutes to make an opening statement and propound questions, except Senator Nunn and myself. We've already made an opening statement, so we'll confine ourselves to 5 minutes each. Secretary Perry. After the Long Commission investigated the October 1983 bombing of the Marine barracks in Beirut, its report recommended that Secretary of Defense direct the development of doctrine, planning, organization, force structure, education, and training necessary to defend against and counter to terrorism. Our losses after this latest attack suggest that the Department of Defense has not implemented this recommendation. Can you explain our security lapse in light of the Long Commission recommendation?
Mr. Chairman, I believe that the Department of Defense does have a very strong emphasis on force protection, including, where appropriate, protection against terrorists. Most recently, in the course of policies and the course of education, we have just authorized the anti-terrorist program, which General Shalikashvili described to you. He may want to make an additional comment about the implementation of that program, which is quite recent.
Mr. Chairman, we do have printed, distributed, taught in the schools, practiced on exercises, joint doctrine to deal with terrorism. We do, in fact, practice it. As terrorism evolves and becomes more sophisticated and becomes more linked to sophisticated terrorist-sponsored governments, we have to continually improve in our training, in our education, as well as in those protective measures that we have around our facilities. But I believe that our compliance with the recommendation of the Long Commission on this particular score is quite good.
General Shalley, it appears that at the upper levels, the Department of Defense and the Joint Staff were either unaware or insufficiently attentive in preparing for this most recent attack, despite numerous internal warnings, indications, and similar attacks. What does this tell us about priorities and organization?
Mr. Chairman, I believe that as both Secretary Perry and General P have already testified, we did have intelligence that caused us to raise our security level from low some 18 months ago to medium before the OPM Sang bombing to high almost immediately after the OPM Sang bombing. And we have maintained that high terrorist threat warning throughout the period to include up to the day of the bombing at Khobar Tower. We have also issued all the, I believe, the requisite instructions to the field to cause a re-examination of our security posture. The results of that re-examination have been described by General P. I tried to touch upon the additional measures that the Secretary felt was necessary that we take in order to take a broader, more long-range view on what ought to be done to strengthen our anti-terrorist posture. I think we have done a very exhaustive effort to ensure we understand better what policy changes, what direction, what guidance have to be given to the regional commanders so they can better deal with this heightened terrorist threat, not just in the Middle East, but in all the regions where we have our forces stationed. So I do not believe that the department, from its perspective, has either ignored the situation or has somehow been lax in its attention to what needed to be done. But much of the work is done by the regional commanders, and it is the department's responsibility to ensure that they are tasked to do that work, and then that we stand ready to provide them the resources that they might request of us to get the job done. I believe those things were accomplished, Mr. Chairman.
General P., when was the last time prior to the attack that you visited the military complex, and what was your assessment, both from personal observation and briefings from subordinates, of the adequacy of the security infrastructure and policies at the complex?
Mr. Chairman, I never visited the complex prior to the attack. I visited this particular command, its leadership, and its senior leadership a number of times over the past 24 months. I had staff that visited that particular facility. I've mentioned to you that I have a number of housing facilities. My focus at that time was on force protection kinds of elements in a series of commander conferences phone calls with my subordinate commanders, and meetings with ambassadors. I met principally prior to this time on the operational level, dealing with flights into Iraq, the Gulf, working rules of engagement, security, combat CSAR, search and rescue kinds of operations. I had not physically visited this building or that site prior to the attack.
My time is up, Senator Nunn.
Thank you, Senator Thurman. Mr. Secretary, there was a November '95 bombing in Saudi Arabia. After that, there was an assessment made. Is that assessment classified, and could you furnish that to us?
This is the vulnerability assessment
Yes.
of Khobar Towers in particular?
Yes.
Yeah, we had the Office of Special Investigations conducted a vulnerability assessment of Khobar Tower. That was published early this year. It is available, yes. I've already directed that being made
So that's
available
not a
to the committee.
classified document then?
It is classified, but it can be available.
Could you make it available
It will be
to the
available to
committee?
the committee, yes.
Good.
Be happy to make it available to the committee.
General P., you mentioned there were a number of housing complexes in your command, I assume also in Saudi Arabia. Do you have any count, do you have any number of how many facilities are in your command that have similar arrangements or are exposed or vulnerable to this kind of attack in your command?
I can try and roll those up to you subjectively, Senator Nunn. I would tell you that in open session here, Khobar Towers was one of our better prepared facilities. We have enormous work to do across the entire region, to include in Saudi Arabia, to upgrade these postures. Many of these facilities go back 40, 50 years.
Well, you're talking about 10, 20, 100, 1,000. Give us some range, some general estimate of how many, what the scope of this vulnerability is with our military personnel.
I would say in Saudi Arabia, this is really rough, maybe 10, but they vary in different size. Some are high-rise kinds of configurations, others are spread over
What
large
about
distance.
in your whole command?
I would say 50 major facilities that I deal with.
General Shalley, could you tell us in your just ballpark figure how many around the world do we have where we have these kind of vulnerabilities?
The threat, of course, varies, but if the threat were the same in other parts, we are talking of hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of such facilities.
Now, I assume you're talking about upgrading. You're talking about substantial amounts of money. Is that right?
Sir, I think the upgrades would go to moving away from urbanization areas, which would require large monies in relocation, or going through what we did 15 years ago as we first came upon this threat on the ambassadorial side of large dollars associated with hardening facilities.
What about in Bosnia, General Shalikashvili? That's certainly a high-risk area. And we had the headlines in the Washington Post yesterday morning about Mujahideen that are still located there, perhaps in police forces, still abusing civilians, according to that report and so forth. What kind of vulnerability we have in Bosnia?
The situation is very different in Bosnia because the forces we have there, for the most part, are units that are stationed in caserns that we have constructed that are away from urban areas where we have a pretty extensive perimeter. And while they are always vulnerable, as we said before, because terrorists find ways to overcome almost any defense, they're vulnerable in a very different sense because in most cases they can have standoff distances. Most cases they are, in fact, armed. Their danger runs into when they're on patrols.
More than in Bosnia.
So it's a different threat, but obviously whenever you're in an environment as you are in Bosnia, the last thing you can do is assume that you're not vulnerable to terrorist attacks. You are, and they are.
General P., did the Saudi officials turn down a request to extend the perimeter at Khobar Towers facility? And if so, was this decision appealed up to your level of the chain of command? And did you pass it on if it got to you?
Sir, I don't know the exact answer to that. I think that'll be one of the questions that'll have to be resolved in the under
You would know
sworn
whether such a
testimony, but
request you would know whether it got to you, wouldn't you?
it never came to Central Command, and I don't know if it came to the next intermediate command between me and the commander really at the front end of the spear.
So it never got to your level.
It did not. Now,
Could it have gotten to General Shalikashvili or Secretary Perry?
it would not have if it did not come to me.
That would have had to come through you.
It would have had to come through me, and I would like to say that that I probably would have, I know I would have tried to have worked that problem first before I ever raised it to the chairman's or the Secretary of Defense's level.
In other words, if it had come to you, you would have tried to work it directly with your counterparts in Saudi Arabia and defense officials rather than passing it on to the Secretary of Defense?
Certainly initially, and I think in the background of my opening comments of understanding the culture, I think that you very well would have seen me work that for a considerable period of time as we work with the host government to try to fix that particular challenge.
Chairman, my time has expired. Thank you.
Senator Warner.
Thank you. I'm going to pick up on that question by Senator Nunn because it seems to me the responsibility of this committee is to establish accountability. We're not out here in headhunts or anything like that, but the buck stops here at this committee because the people of the United States look to the Congress as the ones really ultimately responsible for the welfare of the men and women of the armed forces that take these risks all over the world. And General P., I'm stunned by the answer that it's almost 2 weeks since this incident, and you still do not know whether or not your subordinates appealed this decision above the, as I understand, the general officer level in the field.
Well, let me tell you what I've gotten telephonically, and I have deliberately tried not to get into that detail while the investigation is ongoing by General Downing. There's lots of noise.
I assume the president would have been interested in this and would have called in and asked, well, what happened out there? You knew that we were coming up here with this hearing. So I must say I'm stunned by that.
Well, let me try, Senator Warner, to go further with it. Certainly in my conversations with subordinate commanders through the chain, in a period of grief and mourning that's still going on today, where in the early days you get conflicting information, I have always found over my 35 years it's best to be steady and be sure you understand the information that you're hearing. The information that I've been hearing to date, which I don't want to say is final until it's under some sworn testimony or the investigation by General Downing's committee is done, is that on several occasions, read at least 2, that at the colonel level, the 06 level, there was conversations with Saudi host government people at province, state, security level in the Eastern Province region, that those personnel were working through the issue, that a number of other concessions were made, whether it be in increasing fence levels out with more hardened barriers, cutting vegetation on private land, those kinds of concessions.
General, my time is going to be lost. I talked to General Shalikashvili by telephone 3 or 4 days ago, right, General? I asked you this explicit question. You said, I'll get back to you in a few minutes. You then, I think, contacted General P. You said the answer is yet to be developed. And I guess I dropped it at that point on the assumption by the time this hearing came along there could be some evidence shed on that question I put to you. 1, what was the discussion? Was it appealed up the chain? And 2, were there any corroborative documents like written requests by the on-scene commander to the Saudi government? And you said you'd make that available. I guess it's still not available to this committee. Is that correct?
Senator Warner, it is not available to me. I discussed the matter with General P. after you and I had talked about it. What I had told you was correct. The information had not come to me. The information had not come to General P. I am not aware of any written records of that request. I've reported to me as a result of that inquiry by General P. just what he told you right now, that at the colonel level there had been those discussions on at least 2 occasions.
Yesterday I had a talk with the ambassador from Saudi Arabia to the United States, Prince Bandar, and I've recommended to the chairman that he appear before this committee in closed session later today.
Incidentally, I talked to him yesterday, too,
Yes.
and he may be invited to a closed session today.
I would urge that, Mr. Chairman. But statements that he made to me are in direct conflict with some of the evidence before this committee this morning. Now, at some point, we've got to resolve that as a committee. So I'll press on to you, Mr. Secretary. I was taken by the forthright analysis you put in your statement regarding the intelligence reports. Let me read two of your sentences. But the intelligence information, while voluminous and pointing to a high threat level, was also fragmentary and inconclusive. Further on, you say, but it seems clear that local commanders would have put a higher priority on timing if they had perceived a threat as sophisticated and as powerful as actually occurred. Now, that appears to me to indicate you have a judgment that it was an intelligence failure by the U.S. military as well as the Saudi, presumably, cooperative intelligence system. I think it's important to the American public that people in your position of responsibility from time to time state very clearly, was there or was there not an intelligence failure in your judgment in this case?
I would say not an intelligence failure. We had much intelligence on what was going on relative to the terrorist threat, not only in Saudi Arabia, in the Mideast. It was intelligence of a strategic level, so that we knew we had a high threat level. We called a high threat level based on the intelligence. That was a very important achievement of an intelligence. The intelligence was not useful at a tactical level. It didn't specify the nature of the threat or the timing of the threat, and therefore it was not what we might call actionable intelligence in terms of doing our planning. And also, the intelligence, I think, inevitably in this kind of a problem was contradictory. And there's probably not a week go by that General Shelley and I don't get intelligence warnings of a specific threat like this. And maybe 1 out of 10 of them will turn out to be correct. So there's a lot of noise in the system.
Let me refer you, I'm sure you've seen this New York Times piece of July 7th. It seems to me a very thorough piece on the subject. Now, in this particular sentence I'll read, we're referring to the failure by the Saudi government to allow our FBI to interview the perpetrators of the Riyadh bombing. But this statement is made, "We are running with a base of knowledge that's virtually zero," said one senior American intelligence official. "We didn't know anything about these people." Now, I think the antecedent is, of course, these four. So it seems to me there's a good deal of documentation around here that, and I believe your statement indicates that we've got to probe very seriously as to our own decision about the intelligence.
I think we need very much more effort on human, and that has to be in cooperation.
Well, we've all known that.
That has to be in cooperation with the Saudi
I
government.
understand that. And that's a subsidiary question, if not a primary one, in this entire investigation by the committee. We've got to determine the level of cooperation with the Saudi government. But, Mr. Secretary, in your opening remarks, you stated there is no issue that I feel more deeply about or task that I work harder than the safety and the welfare of our military personnel. Yet we're learning today of a failure to bring forward up through the chain of command what now appears to everyone a very serious breakdown between the discussions between our military and perhaps the U.S. Embassy in Saudi and the Saudi government about the need to improve security. Did you implement, as a part of your concern about overseas security, instructions to your subordinates to bring these questions up to you personally?
We always promote exercising the chain of command vigorously in both directions, and that certainly includes calling for help when you need help. And the judgment call here was whether they thought they needed help. In retrospect, it seems clear they did, and it's quite clear that General P. and General Shalley and I would have been prepared to help had we gotten this request.
Thank you. My time is up, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Levin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just so that the record is clear from what you just said, then, Secretary Perry, this request to extend the perimeter never came to you personally.
And that is correct.
We have this just a tragic reminder here that the number one threat that Americans face here and abroad is terrorism, and this is a major change in terms of threats to our security, but it's been clear that this is the major threat ever since the Cold War is over, and clearer yet that the war against terrorists have got to be fought on many fronts. This has been pointed out this morning. They aim at targets randomly. They do not limit themselves to military targets. This one happened to be, but they aim at civilians just as often as they aim at military or government targets. And we've seen that here in this country with the World Trade Center. I think your focus, all of your focus is this morning on what you're doing about terrorism and the importance of changing the direction of the expenditure of our resources to fight the war against terrorism instead of some of the older battles that have been fought, and in many cases won, is very important testimony, and I'm very glad to hear it. I want to also explore this question of the discussions, to the extent that you know them, on site about that perimeter, because I think that obviously is the key question here. Major General Anderson on a television program said the following, and as I understand, he would be the commanding general of Southern Watch. Is that correct?
That's correct, sir.
And so he would be the commander of General, is it Chalier, or am I pronouncing his name correctly? And this is what General Anderson said, that at two different times at a working level, requests were made of Saudi security personnel to move the particular barrier out farther away. And the response was no. And then he went on to say, it wasn't a we don't care, therefore no. It was we care, we need to work with you on force protection issues. Now, have any of you discussed this matter with General Anderson?
I have not directly, well, I'm not sure. I may have over the last 2 weeks with the hundreds and hundreds of phone calls that we've had on this issue. Again, I would caution that we not be so sure we're going to get this exactly correct. I think what we've got here, sir, is at the General Chalier level, I've tried to think through what was going on in his mind at this time. I think you've got a commander there that has got a lot of installations working for him. He's pursuing a threat. He's conducting air operations into Iraq. He's working, bringing the carrier battle group in to integrate the ATO in, and he's dealing with local officials. He's got some very qualified people that are working for him, and they are working daily in the province. They are working with the ambassadorial team, the chargé, those people to try to consult is the word that's used very much in the region to affect change. I think you had that ongoing at a time that you had a significant change in the threat and the terrorists got into us. So I don't think it's a case, was the fence in too close? I think most people would clearly say yes, it was. I mean, I think it's a common sense reaction that you want to get greater distance from you in terms of protection. Was that problem being worked very vigorously by young people up and down the chain of command? I think it probably was in very tough, harsh conditions. Do you think that that should always result in passing something up the chain of command? I don't know, in the number of things that he's working, and I find it difficult today to try to second guess a forward deployed commander, because that's what happens, you know. We could be working the fence and we'd have had them go through the gate like in Beirut, and I'll tell you, we would have had hundreds and hundreds of casualties. So I'm a little reluctant to get into a priority of work effort that a youngster that's forward is enduring. Should the fence have been out further? Yes. Were they working it? I think they probably were. Should they have kicked it upstairs? I don't know. I just don't know.
What is clear is that they did not kick it upstairs. That's what we've heard from each of the three of you this morning. Now, on a previous terrorist attack in Riyadh, we had a request of the Saudis to interrogate the terrorists prior to their execution. And as I understand it, that request had been denied. Can you tell us about that, as to whether or not that's true? We had, what is it, last November at the OPM saying, November of 1995, persons were arrested, they were convicted by whatever process they use in Saudi Arabia, and were executed. But before the execution, as I read the media here, there was a request for us to discuss this with those terrorists. Did we make that request? Was it denied by the Saudis? And if so, why was it denied, and how far up the chain did that request go to the Saudis? I could ask maybe Secretary
I'm
Perry.
only a third-hand source of information on that, Senator Levin.
Then let me interrupt you then. Do we have a second or first-hand source of information here?
I think, sir, that probably was handled in DCI and FBI chains. It did not come to the military.
So your information is as good as we're going to have this morning.
All
Thank
right.
you. Secretary Perry?
I have discussed, I've raised this question to Director Free. This was not an action that we were directly involved in. I was specifically raising it to him relative to my visit over to Saudi Arabia, my plan to meet with the leadership, because I wanted to make clear that we absolutely had to have full cooperation on this investigation. And so I wanted to get the background on what had happened there so that I could be clear that we did not have that problem this time. I did meet with King Fahad, as I indicated. He directed, in my presence, he directed the Minister of Interior to provide full cooperation to do this as a joint project with the FBI. Subsequently, Director Free has met with the Minister of Interior in Saudi Arabia and was promised that full cooperation. We must have full cooperation this time. We cannot accept the problems we had the last time. Again, I'm not the witness to describe to you how that situation went the last time, but I can tell you how important it is that we have full cooperation this time.
My time is up. Thank you.
Senator McCain.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, we all recognize the deaths of 19 Americans is a tragic example of the risks that are willingly assumed every day by the men and women in our armed forces. And I believe that all Americans should understand that the U.S. military personnel serving in Saudi Arabia are there to protect our vital national interests. At the same time, prior to the tragedy of June 25th, measures to protect our forces from terrorist attacks were clearly inadequate, and testimony that I've heard so far indicates that. The President of the United States waged war against terrorism by means of a summit meeting in a resort town in Egypt where there were 240 minutes of opening statements, 40 minutes of discussion, and a photo opportunity. The summit produced a lot of symbolism, but little in the way of concrete recommendations to combat terrorism. Syria, identified by the State Department as one of the world's leading sponsors of terrorism, did not attend the meeting. The aiding and abetting, the participants couldn't even agree to specifically condemn Iran for aiding and abetting terrorist groups. The only result of the summit was a lofty joint statement by President Clinton and Egyptian President Mubarak condemning terrorism and promising future cooperation and consultation on ways to halt these attacks. I quote from the President's statement, "We must actively counter the terrorists with all the means at our command, combining our efforts tangibly and joining our strength to defeat their evil aims." Now, little more than 3 months after the summit in Egypt and after another couple of international get-togethers to talk tough on terrorism, 19 more Americans have been killed by a terrorist bomb. What happened to the goals proclaimed at the Egypt summit? After the Riyadh bombing in November, it was clear that security at U.S. installations in Saudi Arabia had to be increased. And apparently General Pei did not visit the facilities, did not keep close track of security enhancements,
and still doesn't seem to have a good grasp of the situation under his command. I would have suggested, General Pay, for example, you call up the general and ask him what he was thinking rather than coming here and conjecturing as to what his thoughts were. In all due respect, Secretary Perry, you did not answer Senator Levin's question. Were we or were we not allowed to interrogate those men that were beheaded, those terrorists that were arrested and beheaded in Riyadh? Do you know the answer to that, Secretary Perry?
I know that Director Free told me we were not.
We were not. And so how does that jibe with the cooperation that was pledged at the multi-million-dollar cost of the taxpayer summit in Egypt?
Senator McCain, as I testified to Senator Levin, that does not jibe with it and is not acceptable. We must have full cooperation this time.
You keep talking about full cooperation, Secretary Perry. Were we ever fully informed of the results of the Riyadh investigation? Did we press for it? I mean, obviously the Saudis interrogated these people. Did we ever press for or receive any information about what information the Saudis received if we were denied access to them?
I believe the FBI did press for that, yes.
But, Mr. Secretary, you're the one that's responsible for the security of these men and women. Wouldn't you want to have that information?
I do want it, and I am going to insist on getting it on this investigation.
Did you ask for it at the time?
I did not ask for it at the time.
And yet, you stated in your statement here, you said in November last, you state that you said, at that point, we made what we believed to be a prudent judgment that this attack might not be an isolated event, but a new trend and a high terrorist threat level to Saudi Arabia. You made that judgment that it would be a high terrorist threat level to Saudi Arabia, and yet you didn't ask for the information that was obtained from the previous terrorists that were arrested, tried, and executed?
We are asking for it, and as I testified, we expect full cooperation from the Saudis in this investigation.
But you did not ask for it, according to your testimony, at the time.
That is correct.
I think that answer speaks for itself. Should it be of interest to the American people that the funding for anti-terrorism, according to a Defense Department report, the deep cuts in the, I quote, deep cuts in the Defense Department's own anti-terrorism funding, an 82% drop at the Air Force since 1994, and a 57% dip at the Army since 1989? Is that the way we try to combat terrorism and make it a high priority by cutting that much funding on our anti-terrorism efforts?
Now, I think that it was a bad cut. I have directed the services to increase the funding in anti-terrorism.
When did you direct the services to increase the funding, Secretary Perry?
Let General Shally describe to you the specific anti-terrorism study we made, and that was one of the findings that came out of that study.
The anti-terrorism study identified two issues pertaining to funding of anti-terrorism things. One, that the services increase their funding, and secondly, a recommendation to the Secretary of Defense that we create a program line under the Secretary of Defense with which he can fund high priority anti-terrorism programs that need to be funded. Those recommendations went to him within the last month and a half, and he approved it within the last month.
One of the recommendations was to put Mylar on the windows of the barracks. Reports are that it cost $4.5 million, and that money was not available, and so the decision to put Mylar on the windows to prevent glass shattering was put off until October the 1st. Is that true, General Pay? Do you know?
I think Mylar was one of a number of initiatives that the commander was working on the ground. He put that in his plan, I guess you would call that, for funding. Put his other monies at other kinds of upgrades.
So the answer is that, yes, it was delayed until the 1st of October? Until the next
we have already
year
ordered, I think, $100,000 in the past month. That Mylar will be placed on the windows as the windows are reconstituted and put back in the barracks now over the next several years.
Over the next several years.
Well, we may not be in that facility in the next several years, so one of the thoughts here was to try to get a quick movement out of that facility to another area that's better in terms of defense. So the young people in the chain were looking at not putting money against that facility if you're going to move. Like I said, we have placed $100,000 now on the external windows, and those are being worked.
But in the meantime, General, the young people that you referred to were not adequately protected. My time is up, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Lieberman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, as I listened to the testimony here today, it seems to me that in response to the attack in Riyadh last November, that a number of steps were taken which were aimed at increasing the level of security. And in fact, as one of the witnesses testified this morning, those steps undoubtedly had some effect on diminishing the number of casualties from the terrorist attack at Dhahran. But the obvious fact is that they didn't do enough, because 19 Americans are dead. And I think it's in that spirit that we're going forward here with this inquiry. Sometimes these questions are going to be tough, but we all have an interest. We have a shared interest, and I'm sure the witnesses agree with this, to make sure that we do everything humanly possible, understanding that hindsight is clearer than foresight, and understanding that terrorists, as has been said, will always search for the vulnerable target and then hit it. But we can't ever come to another hearing months or years from now and look back and say we didn't do enough, particularly when we're dealing with a large but nonetheless finite number of military installations. It's one thing to say that we can't protect every civilian target of a terrorist, but I think we've got to create a record here where we learn from this tragedy and never face a situation like this. I might say parenthetically, and I appreciate the spirit of the questions here today, that in addition to the tragic loss of life, it seems to me that the last thing we want to give the terrorists here is a sense that their act has either dissuaded the United States from its pursuit of the vital national interests we have in the Gulf region, that the terrorist bomb will separate us from our allies in Saudi Arabia, even though we may want to join with them in some mutual self-analysis and self-criticism, or that we become divided in this country, one against the other. But I must say, some of the things that I've heard today, as much as I know how much of an effort was made after Riyadh to avoid a similar situation, do trouble me. For instance, I don't know how we can say that there was not an intelligence failure here, Mr. Secretary. General P used the word that the intelligence forces performed competently, perhaps competently, but certainly not adequately, or else this would not have happened. I want to go to something else, and that is, General P, your comment about whether that officer on the ground who had the conversation with his Saudi counterpart about extending the perimeter to the 400 feet should have kicked it upstairs. It seems to me, and your question, your statement, you're not really sure. I think we've got to create a record here that sends an unmistakable message, in spite of all that's going on in a theater like this, that security, protection, force protection is so important that once we have designated the security level, the threat level as high, that any question as fundamental as this one of extending the perimeter has to be kicked up almost immediately. It's as if there was a bomb ticking here, and we could have done something. And we had one bright officer on the ground who understood that we could have done something to limit, perhaps eliminate any casualties here, and it wasn't done. And I want to ask you if you would reconsider that question about whether, in fact, reconsider your statement about whether, in fact, that officer should have kicked this upstairs, this decision.
Sir, that's a great question. You are into the guts of what we call the art of command. I think we have to have latitude and judgment at every level, platoon leader, company commander, battalion commander, all the way up the chain of command. I don't think we can necessarily legislate what should be kicked up. Now, having said that, you have to have an openness and a style of command that does encourage those kinds of things to come up. I think we have that style of command among the subordinate commanders in Central Command, and I'd like to point out to the committee the kinds of people that we're talking about here now. In the Army Component Commander, Steve Arnold, who was the G3 during the Gulf War for our country, basically, for General Yosak and General Schwarzkopf. Also went to Somalia with the 10th Mountain Division and is now back. Lieutenant General John Jumper just picked to be the Deputy Chief of Staff of Operations for the Air Force out of his job as the Air Force Component Commander, and you certainly understand the importance of that job to the Air Force.
Excuse me, I regret doing this, but I know my time is limited.
Well, I guess I'm trying, sir, to point out to you that this is a very competent chain of command that encourages openness. I don't think that if I legislated kick up an argument at the province level, I think I could come up with another 50. I think we have to teach our youngsters to make those value judgments. And I understand the thrust of your question, but I'm not so sure I'm on your side on this one, sir.
Okay, well, I regret that, and I say respectfully, I think that's exactly the wrong message to send. Again, I understand that hindsight is clearer than foresight, but we've got a situation. Let me put it to you this way. Secretary Perry, General Shally, General P., you've come before us and over again said to us that you want us to authorize a level of support for our troops that makes sure that, first, we can deter conflict. Second, if we face conflict, that we will not only win it, but we will win it with minimal, hopefully zero casualties to American forces. And you, Mr. Secretary, have been very insistent on that. I think part of what we're saying here, as you look at it, is that we've protected ourselves so well and we've performed so well in battle that there's a danger here that enemies of ours will strike at our vulnerability. And one of the vulnerabilities here is to terrorism. And I think now we've got to bring that same heightened, urgent, comprehensive desire to protect our forces not only to the battlefield, but sadly, when they're just in installations or in apartments as they were at Khobar, and that the message should be that this is such a priority that no colonel on the ground faced with the slowness of the Saudi response will just take that. They'll go right to the top and say, lives are on the line here. This has the same consequences as if we sent some people into battle without adequate support, without adequate weaponry. Mr. Secretary, do you want to respond to that?
I will agree on that later.
Dealing with terrorism is a difficult and fundamentally different problem than trying to deal with military conflict, and it does challenge the traditional approaches to chains of command. I do believe we still have to use our chains of command to deal with it, and I do believe we still have to allow for judgment down the chain of command. I, of course, wish this issue had been brought up to me, and I know what my answer would have been had it been brought up to me. But General P's point, I think, was quite right. If you set up a system that forces that to be brought up, how many other hundreds or thousands of issues are going to be brought up, and how that might clog the chain of command? I think that was the basic point he was making, and I understand that point.
Well, my time's up respectfully. I don't understand it because, and I understand the difficulty of the thousands of items that may be raised, but this, as we see here, is life and death. I don't even want to criticize that particular officer. I'm saying let's learn from it and create a climate where the next time somebody has so fundamental a security concern that they don't think twice when they don't get an adequate response from the host country of bringing it right to the top. My time's up. I thank the chair.
Well, the trouble is you've got the movement of senators over there. You go to your next senator. Lieberman is finished.
Senator Smith?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary and General Shalley and General P. These kinds of tragedies are always very difficult for all of us, and unfortunately, even though we do sometimes the best we can, tragedies do occur. That is a risk that all of our military personnel take, and one of the airmen who lost his life was Peter Morgera of Stratham, New Hampshire. And I'm trying to be fair about it and to give the benefit of the doubt, but this is very difficult. I want to focus back, General P, for a moment on this issue that's been raised several times by other members on the discussions that you used the term discussions, quote unquote, with an officer regarding the extension of the perimeter. Was there a formal request originated anywhere to extend the perimeter of that compound?
My understanding is, in verbal conversation, that there was
not a verbal conversation. I'm asking about was there a
there
formal
was not a
request?
formal request, but I also have heard that there was a memorandum for the record that that the officer involved made of that particular request. But I would again, sir, tell you that these conversations were in a period of grief and mourning. There's a lot of misinformation out there, in my judgment, as I have looked over these past 2 weeks. And so I caveat it, sir.
I realize there's still an investigation, but let me ask the question again, and if you can give me a yes or no answer. To your knowledge, was there ever a formal request by anybody in the command at any level to extend the perimeter of that fence, to extend the perimeter of that compound?
Not to my knowledge. Not a formal written request. Not to my knowledge.
Now, in the discussion that took place with an officer and a Saudi official, do any of the three of you know whether or not there was any representative outside of the military of the U.S. government present at that conversation? Any member of the Defense Department, State Department, any non-military official present at that conversation?
Sir, I don't know.
Do you know, General Shalley?
I don't know.
Mr. Secretary? What was the circumstance of that conversation? Where was it?
Sir, I don't know. I think the context was that that these people were working together over a number of days, maybe even months, on a series of force protection upgrades. This was one of those that were discussed. It's my feel that a number of these particular areas were agreed to, and they were working through this particular challenge. And again, it goes back to my point about defense is never finished.
Well,
they were working through the problem.
If the press reports are accurate, the Saudis, quote unquote, said no to extension of the perimeter. Is that correct?
Sir, I can't go on the press reports.
I'm asking you, is that correct or not?
I don't know.
Mr. Secretary, is it correct that the Saudis formally denied the extension of the perimeter?
Senator Smith, I want to get the answer to that question. The report that I have to this stage, which may turn out to change as we get more formal testimony on it, but the report that I have to date is that it was requested of some Saudi official, and the answer was not no, but the answer was not now, not yet. That was my understanding of how the discussion went.
Well, who made the request of the Saudi official?
Again, my understanding of it was a colonel in 06 in the command.
On his own, without direction from superiors?
Yes.
The issue, following up just briefly on Senator McCain's comment about 82% drop at the Air Force in this study regarding anti-terrorism funding, that report also does indicate that a lot of that funding reduction came as a result of the closure of bases, to be fair, not just to cut on active bases, but it does say that some of the cuts are due to it says that the cuts are due to base closings where security is no longer needed, but the report still argues that future funding levels will be inadequate to cover the security of sensitive areas. Were any reprogramming requests made of the Congress to reprogram dollars back into the facilities around the world, specifically the Saudi Arabia facilities or any other facilities in Bosnia or any place else around the world?
I am not aware of any. Also, we have been for quite some time putting quite a bit of money into security upgrades into our facilities, housing areas, and so on. Much of that work has already been done. And so when we started out with a zero base, there was a need for a different amount, a much larger amount than there is on a day-to-day basis today. So part of that is because part of the reduction is because some bases have been closed, part of it because much of the work has already been done, but there's clearly more work to be done, and the Anti-Terrorist Task Force have found that we had reduced that funding too much, so services have to reprogram more money into it, and we have to create a OSD-controlled fund site for it as well.
But the fact is that funding for the security of military installation comes under the operation and maintenance accounts for the most part. And those accounts since 1993 have been cut. They've been cut 8.6% since 1993. The President's request this year has a 7% cut in operation and maintenance account. And we've had testimony, I believe it was General Krulak who testified that he at times didn't have appropriate materials, tents, perhaps leaky tents in Bosnia, sleeping bags that were inadequate and so forth, clothing. I mean, these are all falling under this quality of life area. And I think, you know, you cannot come up here and say that you're doing everything possible to ensure adequate security with those kinds of reductions, unless the O&M accounts are being cut and you're putting money somewhat, you're taking the cuts elsewhere other than in security, but that's not what this report says. Let me just ask one more question, perhaps, I guess, Secretary Perry, you. Why are we continuing to use American pilots to enforce the no-fly zone? Can't the Saudi pilots begin to take up more and more of this?
We have American pilots, British pilots, French pilots, all involved in the no-fly zone. I believe that we need, for the deterrence of Iraq, I believe we need the presence of U.S. forces in the area, and in particular the presence of air forces in the area. And the access to the Saudi bases we have not only provides that no-fly zone, it provides deterrence, and it provides the base on which we would build if we got in a war. I think it is a very good decision to have.
What percentage of those flights do American pilots fly, do you know?
Let me ask General P. on that.
Let me give you an approximate answer in closed session. I'll give it to you in exact, but it's not uncommon to put up 100 flights a day, a night into Iraq. 65% of that, 70% of those are combat kinds of flights. The others are support.
And what percentage are American pilots, or you want to do that in an executive session?
Almost all are American. There are a few, as the Secretary said, British and French.
Thank you.
Senator Bryan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Well, one of the other security failures that has been alleged, and this question is to you, General P., is that there are other facilities, in fact, the word was used, ample facilities, to billet the officers and enlisted personnel who were in the structure that was so badly damaged and we all realize painfully so vulnerably because of its proximity to the perimeter, that there were other facilities that could have been used, would have provided a greater measure of protection for those personnel, and that the military was reluctant to make that relocation because it would be considered disruptive. May I get your comment and response as to the accuracy of the criticism, and if it is accurate, why were not changes made?
I have not heard that. I know in the midst of this incident that we did move a number of the outside occupants to other buildings internal, but I have not heard the criticism that you've mentioned.
Well, aside from the criticism, I mean, you have indicated that it was at your request that the threat level was elevated to high. That was your testimony earlier. It's my understanding that there is only one level higher than high, and that's critical. So to put this in some context, from your perspective, you saw this as a very, very dangerous area because of what had occurred in November and the intelligence data that was coming to you and other commanders. My question, aside from the criticism, is if there were other places that these personnel could have been billeted at Khobar on the interior, why wasn't that done?
Again, I don't know if there were empty rooms. Certainly we could have doubled up people internal. That's a commander judgment on the ground.
So at this point, you're not able to share with the committee as to whether there were other facilities at Khobar where these personnel could have been placed so that they would not have been as close to the perimeter?
I don't think there were any housing. Now, could we have put people in dining facilities and other recreational areas that were more internally located? I suspect that that could have been an action, but I think this all goes back to the bigger question of how you looked at the threat. And I don't think that the threat was perceived, even though high, the magnitude of the threat that would cause the destruction that was caused, I don't think was in the mindset of all of us up and down the chain of command.
Well, General, let me just say in all due respect, I find that somewhat shocking. I don't have the kind of background that you have in security matters, but we have seen all over the world, whether it's the World Trade Center or what occurred in parts of the world that we've seen terrorist activities. It just seems to me that it's not a greatly sophisticated exercise of judgment that the larger the vehicle, the more of these explosives that can be placed in those vehicles, and that the larger the volume of explosives, the greater damage it can be done. So, I mean, I must say that it seems to me it's a fairly elementary thing if you have a sizable vehicle, which is actually what occurred, that indeed this particular structure is highly vulnerable, and I don't think it's any great surprise to even those of us who are laymen that if you get that kind of explosive combination there, that you can do the kind of damage that we saw tragically at Khobar. Is that something that's new to military commanders, or is that a fair assessment?
That's a great question, and I think that is really the issue of what has changed. What has changed to our country and to all of the countries in the Gulf is that we now have a changed threat. The introduction of large explosives of the kind that you're now talking about, this was something that was not expected by all of the governments in the Gulf.
Of a technology leap or breakthrough, it's just a question if you can assemble a certain volume of explosive, you can create tremendous damage. But let me pursue another line of questioning. Mr. Secretary, is it possible to accomplish this mission? And I'm one who supported Operation Desert Shield, Desert Storm, believe that decision was correct, believe that we have a vital national security interest in the region. But the question I have is, with all of the risks that we're now painfully aware of, is it possible to accomplish our mission by other than having American military personnel based in Saudi Arabia?
I believe we would seriously compromise our mission if we had to remove our physical presence, our military presence, from Saudi Arabia.
Since the Khobar tragedy, have we made any other request in the nature of additional security protection to the Saudi government that has been denied?
No, we have not, Senator Bryan, and I have put them on notice that we may have very major requests coming up. We have yet I've asked General P to recommend to me what it would be involved in moving our military forces out of Riyadh. I believe we can provide much better protection at the Khobar Towers. But Riyadh is an urban environment, and I do not know how we're going to provide protection against bombs this size in Riyadh. And therefore, I think the only solution to that problem is we have to move out of Riyadh. I have alerted the King, Crown Prince, Minister of Defense that such a request may be imminent in a matter of weeks.
General P, if I might ask you, because of the difficulties we've seen and what's reported up through the command structure, are you aware of any security requests that have been made at the 06 level, lower or higher, to provide additional security protections in which the Saudis have either declined or have said, look, we're not yet prepared to do that, or we've got to give some thought to it?
No, sir, I'm not.
With respect to the chain of command, let me be clear on this. The news reports, and indeed they may not be accurate, indicate that General Swaleh was aware of these requests that had been made to the Saudi officials to extend the perimeter protection. Is that your understanding, General? We constantly hear about these 06s, and we all understand that those are bird colonels, but General Swaleh is an 07 as a brigadier. Did he have first-hand knowledge? Did he make the request? What, if anything, can you tell us about that?
I'm rather satisfied that in General Swaleh's numerous meetings that he would have weekly on force protection within his command, where you have senior people, they're just not an 06. These are senior colonels of great responsibility in our Army and Air Force. I think that those discussions perhaps went on with regularity in the force protection meetings, but I think many things were being done at a time when the threat was not quite as clear.
Well, we understand that, but the answer then is, to your knowledge, then General Swaleh would have had knowledge of this request?
I think he probably would have, yes, sir.
I think Senator Levin has told us that at least Major General Anderson, who would be the next higher person in the chain of command, did he have knowledge of the request?
I don't know. General Anderson has been in the job about 5 weeks. He's a new commander on the ground. He's an outstanding officer. I don't know the specifics of living the year long or so that the previous commander would have had.
So I guess the last question I would have, other than the 06 or 06s that may have made the request, General Swaleh, who you've indicated because of his briefings would probably have been aware, do we know how much further up the chain of command this information, namely the request to extend the security perimeter, was made?
No, we do not. Again, my judgment is, sir, that it was kept there. I think that they felt that they were working through a series of force protection upgrades and that they were working hard at the problem at hand and perhaps did not need higher help at this time in the context of my comments about the Saudi culture.
I think we all recognize that that was a tragic mistake. Now, my time is up.
Senator Fromm, I want to take this opportunity to welcome you to your first public hearing, I believe, on this committee. You come to us highly recommended as a very able person and a valuable member of this committee, and we'll now be glad to ask you to propound questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I certainly appreciate you calling this hearing to focus on the recent attack against the U.S. military housing complex. This incident has especially importance to me and to the citizens of my state, with Senior Airman Jeremy Taylor of Douglas, Kansas, being one of the victims. Any military operation involves a great deal of risk and danger, certainly. Those who serve in the military know and accept that fact. However, we owe it to the men and women who proudly wear our nation's uniform to make every possible step to ensure the safety of our troops deployed overseas. A number of questions have been asked, Mr. Chairman, that were of concern to me, certainly about the visit to the base, to the housing unit, the briefings that were received. the information that was ascertained and apparently will be available from the November 13th bombing when 5 Americans were killed, and extensive questions about the perimeter. 2 additional questions I would like to ask, and Mr. Secretary, is there any evidence of Syrian or other foreign involvement in the most recent bombings?
Senator Fromm, the investigation is still ongoing. I believe they have not reached a conclusion on that yet. It's possible in the closed hearing to discuss what the evidence one way or the other on that subject is now.
Okay, I'll raise it again later. Thank you. And second, in the big picture for the future, do you anticipate that General Downing's review is going to examine intelligence capacities in assessing threats to our armed forces? Can we expect some review of intelligence gathering and sharing to be better able to take better action to protect our deployed forces?
Part of General Downing's review will be to look at the threat assessment mechanism. That's correct.
And so we could anticipate some
Yes.
additional information?
We can. We expect to give this committee a full report on all of General Downing's findings.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Jackson.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. Welcome to you, gentlemen. And let me start out by saying that these are very difficult hearings. And from what I know of this, I simply want to start out by saying I have every confidence in you, Mr. Secretary. I think it's outrageous, some of the suggestions that have been made with regard to your position. General John, I think as you know, there has been no one connected with the military whom I have more respect for than yourself. And General P., I know this is a very trying time for you also, so this is not an inquisition that we're conducting here. I hope you all know and understand, but there are some legitimate questions that we have. Not so much finger pointing, but to look to the future to see what we can do to avert this. It's been said that, you know, it's so obvious that our forces are in harm's way today more from the result of terrorist action than I think they are potential enemy action. But that's a very, very real threat, and we keep dealing with it over and over and over again, and that is why there are some concerns that we have here, and we have an obligation to try to get to the bottom of it with your help. So please accept the questions that I will ask in that frame of mind. Let me say that we all have a very heavy heart with what has happened there. It was brought home to me very vividly last Friday when I attended the military funeral of Air Force Staff Sergeant Ronald King in Omaha, Nebraska. He was the only airman that was involved from our Offutt base who was killed, and there was a wife and an 11-year-old girl and a 9-year-old son grieving, and these things. This has not been my first military funeral, nor my last, including many that were of very hurried nature in the South Pacific in World War II. But these things keep coming back to haunt us. I guess that we should recognize and realize that this is a chance to not only to remember but salute the excellent men and women of our armed forces who are in harm's way, even though we're not today involved in open hostilities. I have, let me make it clear, there have been many statements today with regard to, whose fault this is and what are we going to do about it. There's a lot of second guessing going on in the United States Senate today. But I would simply point out that the United States Senate had better do some second guessing on its own. A couple of weeks ago on the floor of the United States Senate, the majority of the United States senators, in what I thought was one of the dumbest votes that I have seen here in 18 years, voted to open up Pennsylvania Avenue. I suspect that that vote would not prevail today, as it unfortunately did a couple of weeks ago. So there are times even us vaunted senators make mistakes. I think that even some of those holding hearings today, chairing hearings today on this, who supported opening up Pennsylvania Avenue would have second thoughts today when they begin to understand the realities of the dangerous situation that we have. I simply also say, though, you, Mr. Secretary, and others, I think it's well for you to emphasize that we have a mission to carry out there. We certainly do. You said something to the effect that we should not allow ourselves to be driven out by terrorists. I think all of us agree with that, Mr. Secretary. There have been several statements with regard to your meeting with the King, and he pledged his wholehearted cooperation. You know, the problem, I suspect, is not basically with regard to what the King wants or what you as the Secretary of Defense wants or what even the President of the United States wants. It's the command up and down the line, what priorities they're giving, what priorities are set. It's easy to second guess. But I do want to ask some questions, and I would also say that the statement over and over again that there is no absolute security for our armed forces is a given, and we don't have to say that over and over again. I want to concentrate, if I might, on some of the reports that I have read, and I would like to confirm, if I might, the role that General Schweiler and Colonel Boyle have in this proposition. Is General Schweiler the officer immediately in charge of the command that was affected? And what was the role of Colonel Boyle? As I understand it, he was an expert supposedly over there to advise the local command as to the realities and dangers of the situation. Do I accurately describe those two gentlemen and their responsibilities?
All right. General Schweiler was the wing commander. Let me ask General Pete to give a more precise answer.
I think the way you have described it is a good characterization of the two officers, sir.
Thank you. Now let's follow up on that just a little bit more. In an answer to a question by Senator Bryan, General Pay, you indicated that there may have been places that we could have placed our troops that would not have made them as easily killed by moving them into dining facilities. Is it not true that there were lots of barracks rooms that were not nearly as exposed or nearly as dangerous for our airmen that were killed, dismembered, and wounded by being at a source that was very easy to get to from the standpoint of planting of a vehicle with heavily loaded weapons? I know hindsight's always better than foresight, but I have been led to believe, and correct me if I've been misled, that there were ample quarters on the inside or the other side of the road where the troops would have been much safer. And if we were worried about security there, why didn't we move them?
I don't know the answer to the availability of lots of rooms. I think we'll have to let the investigation determine that. Again, I respectfully admired your words, Senator, that I'm a little hesitant today to second-guess a forward commander in terms of the priorities that he was dealing with at that particular time.
Is it, have you, Mr. Secretary, or have you, General Shalikashvili, or have you, General Pay, had any direct relationships or conversations about any of this with either General Schweiler or Colonel Boyle? I'm sure you read reports whether. Have you, Mr. Secretary, had any direct relationship or conversation with either one of these individuals?
Senator Exon, 4 days after the bombing, I went to Dhahran. At that time, I was briefed by General Schweiler, who described to me what had happened, what they had done to prepare for it, how they had responded to the attack. So he has, I have discussed with him subsequent to the bombing. I've discussed with him some of these issues.
General?
I never met General Doyle to the best of my knowledge. I did meet with General Chevalier about a month before the incident occurred when I visited Dhahran Air Base. While there, he accompanied me and hosted me. And while we were going from one facility to the other, we did talk about force protection. And in those occasions, he briefed me on what they were doing as far as force protection on the base is concerned and as far as force protection and the living facilities was concerned. The issue of moving the barrier or the issue of moving people never came up. So I did not have a discussion with him about those two things in specific. He just briefed me in general terms what they were doing on force protection.
General Pay?
Sort of the same answer, sir. I've had lots of discussions with he as well as his seniors on force protection. Their head was in the game on force protection. As regards this particular fence issue, that discussion never came up.
One last question, if I might, Mr. Chairman. During these conversations with General Swaler, did you discuss in any detail at all with him or his subordinate, Colonel Boyle, the reasons that they did not or were not able to move faster with regard to the concerns that must have been known to them with regard to the potential threat?
We discussed that in general. I have to say, though, that at the time I talked with him, Senator Exxon, it was just a few days after the bombing, and he was focused mostly then on trying to do the healing necessary in his wing, to get the operation back up to full speed again, which he'd just done the day before, and to planning for the moves that he had to make for his forces in the wake of the tragedy. He did end up moving all of the personnel to less exposed rooms. It was done by doubling and tripling up in rooms, but it was accomplished. And he had also succeeded by then in getting the perimeter of the fence extended. So he was focused almost entirely, and my discussions with him were focused almost entirely on where do we go from here.
That subject in that way never came up.
Same way, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Hudson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I, too, joined my colleagues who had a constituent that was killed in Saudi Arabia, and I would like to honor Sergeant Millard D. Campbell from Angleton, Texas, who was about 7 days from coming home from Saudi Arabia, but did not make it. I know that it's hard to have Monday morning quarterbacks sitting here and talking to you about failures of judgment or failures in leadership. But I believe the only way we're going to determine what the problems were is to ask the questions and to determine what we can learn from mistakes that might have been made. So I think the questions certainly should be taken in that spirit. I'd like to ask, in addition to what I think has been covered by others in potential problems that we can learn from, the size of the bomb issue. It has been reported that our intelligence sources said that they did not think that terrorist groups in that part of the world were able to make bombs larger than approximately 200 pounds. Is that correct?
That is not correct, Senator Hutchinson. I have read that account in the media. It is simply not correct. That was always understood to be one possibility of what could happen. In the various...
Secretary Perry, could you just say, in your knowledge then, what was the approximate size of what we thought we were protecting against?
Senator Hutchinson, they were looking at a whole spectrum of threat possibilities, of which not just bombs, going after our transportation, going after our school buses, going after our work areas as well as our housing areas, going after our water supply, going after food supply. The spectrum of ways a terrorist could attack is very wide indeed.
But wouldn't the size of the possibilities
I think what may
determine
have
how
caused some
far
of
a
the
perimeter
confusion
should
on the
be?
size is that in the analysis that had been done, they presented a table of the effects of a bomb of 200-pound size. And therefore, that probably caused people to focus on the 200-pound bomb. But and nobody believed, nobody believed that only a 200-pound bomb could be used. And everybody understood the possibility that a larger bomb could be used.
Do you feel that the intelligence that the armed services had for what was possible was sufficient to see what might have been forthcoming here, a 5,000 pound?
The intelligence was really all-inclusive. It included all of these possibilities, and it did not direct us or focus us to any one of them.
Do you think that our leadership then, if they did have the intelligence about that capability, in addition to the other things you mentioned, was pushing hard enough for protections from what we thought the capabilities might have been?
I think the protection is a responsibility of the commanders, not of the people who give them the intelligence assessment. And they take that responsibility. They based their vulnerability assessment, as I said, on a wide variety of threats. But it is also clear that the specific actions they took relative to force protection would have been effective, much more effective against a 200-pound bomb than a 3,000-pound bomb.
Were there any significant pushes in security after the 4 suspects were executed in May from the November bombing? General P?
I'm sorry, I didn't understand your question.
Were there any significant pushes for security after the May execution of the 4 suspects from the November bombing?
Yes, ma'am. We, after the Opium Sang bombing, we instituted with vigor a number of force protection kinds of measures.
I'm talking about the execution in May, not the bombing in November.
We had a number going on at that time. I don't think there was one thing directly tied to those executions other than our threat level was high. But the commanders were undertaking a number of force protection enhancements all through that period.
Let me just reiterate a concern that I think Senator Lieberman outlined very well. And that is that we have watched terrorist attacks. We obviously do not have a great deal of experience, but we do have some experience. And you made the point that you had a chain of command where you put a lot of responsibility in your commanders, the colonel level down and up. And I'm concerned that as leaders, we are not overlapping the policy directions and the policy considerations, which you say legislate. I don't call it legislation. I call it policy direction. From what we have learned from terrorist acts of the past, that we didn't immediately step in at a higher level and say, we know from November after the bombing, and there were steps taken, there were other steps put on the table that were in negotiation. But I'd like to just ask you if you are rethinking your position about leaving this kind of responsibility at the 06 level or 07 without more direction from the top?
I don't want to in any way leave my comments to indicate that we in Central Command, or that myself personally, is not fully involved in force protection, terrorist kinds of activities with our youngsters up and down the chain of command. But I would suggest that this is very, very sophisticated with a number of ways to attack, and we can talk more about that in closed session today. I simply don't believe that we can pick one, two, or three things. I think we have to educate in our school systems, we educate in our chain of command, we grow, we mentor, we do have policies that we've put out. But at the end of the day, you've got to let that commander at the final cutting edge of the spear make the right call. Now, we run open commands. This is not a closed kind of site. It's a very healthy chain of command, and we do talk. Let me just take this one fence issue, though. Here's what's in my mind all through this. He's working probably 50 initiatives. He's got this fence that he's working with the government. They've given him certain kinds of things. He's working another one over here. Perhaps it's the relocation of his people. And so he says, I've got patrols out there. I'm working better with the Saudi officials. I've got observers on top the towers. I can cover that area against what he perceived was about a 200-pound plus or minus threat. So he's working a number of issues and judgments. It's easy for me. You know, as you go to the site, the first thing you say is, gee, we should have pushed the fence out. I mean, I think that's a common sense approach. You'd think that. I'm just suggesting today that we need to give the youngster his chance. He's got a lot of priorities. We should not second guess him here from Washington today. This is very complex. Finally, ma'am, I think we must be very careful about how we look at the art of command. It's 35 in my years. It's 35 years experience of how to command, up and down the chain. I think I've tried to master that by holding people responsible, by issuing directives, but at various times I have to give them their head. There's no magic secret here. Finally, I think terrorism is changing. We may have to, as you suggest, designate a certain thing will be immediately reported up. Maybe it's a vial of anthrax that's thrown over the berm of a perimeter. I'm not sure where all this is going. It's moving on us. I'm not locked in concrete. If requirements are there that we need to have more exact information, certainly we'll do that. I want you to know today, though, I'm engaged in force protection. I'm engaged in it. I had my fire base run over as a captain in Vietnam. I understand force protection. I care about youngsters. Please don't let this committee go by today thinking that I'm not an engaged commander. I am engaged.
Well, thank you, General P. I appreciate your saying that, because I think the chain of command argument is theoretical, but I think we are now getting experience, very hard one, that we should act on. And I will just end by saying that I have seen officials from previous administrations who have said that when you go to the highest level with Saudis, that they do accede to our requests. And I would just hope that going to the top and setting a policy is not something that you are not considering after this really bad experience. Giving young officers their head is an admirable goal, but I think in light of what has happened, perhaps there needs to be a reversal of leadership trends as well.
General P., before I go to the next senator, if I understood you, you said that the thing that has changed is we now know in the Middle East we can see a bomb of this magnitude. Is that what you said earlier?
I think historically now you've got, Senator Warner, a different circumstance. It was plus or minus 200 pounds at OPM Sang. It's somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 now.
All right, well, I understand, but let's not forget Beirut, which was 18,000, that truck.
There's some discussion on the explosive weight, difference in pounds versus blast.
Thank you. Senator Glenn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think I heard that we were going to have the Saudi ambassador, Prince Bandar.
My understanding is that the chairman will soon announce that at conclusion of the first round by all senators here, we reconvene in S-407, at which time the committee would have an opportunity to hear the testimony of the ambassador from Saudi Arabia to the United States, Prince Bandar.
Talked to him briefly. I know several members of the committee have already talked to him. I think he has he may be able to shed some light on this questioning of the prisoners and also the request for the perimeter moves is my understanding. So I'd suggest we do have that. I'm not sure right after this meeting is the best time to do that, but because we have our respective committee or party conferences coming up. Anyway, we might want to consider that at a different time. Prevention of something like this is dependent on intelligence to a large extent. That's the best way to prevent it, to know the problems in advance. And yet, all this 20/20 hindsight that we're exhibiting here this morning comes from a lot of people in the Congress here, and not just here, but not in this committee, but in the Congress and over in the House, who voted at the same time to cut intelligence funds. I just think that's an interesting observation going past this. I don't know, Mr. Secretary, whether you feel we have enough money into intelligence now or not, and particularly into HUMINT that you mentioned. That's the most difficult kind to develop. Takes years and years and years. You can't turn it on and turn it off by budgets going up and down, and yet that's what we're dependent on. You can't use overhead photography of satellites to pick out what some of these terrorist groups. So I just asked, do you think we're putting enough into intel, number one?
I think in the area of HUMINT, we should have a greater priority and greater resources. The other areas, I think we are well covered.
I agree with that. General P., what are the length of tours of people over there on this assignment?
Sir, it varies. As you look back over the past 5 years, when we were not, we had units rotating very frequently. We have changed now to where some of the key leadership has a year rotation. The units involved, though, will rotate out sometimes at 45 and 90 days.
Okay, well, that's, I was glad to hear you're considering moving out of Riyadh, or at least that may be a request we make one of these days. I don't see any reason at all why we keep people concentrated in an urban area after this. Now, I know 20/20 hindsight, I don't want to say that...
Sir, we were studying that before this particular bombing.
You sure got lots of land area over there. We've all been there and have seen the place. You got lots of land area to play around in out there, or to have people based in, whether it's in inflatable structures or tents or whatever. And with short tours like this, unaccompanied tours, this is a great training experience for our people over there out in the desert, as well as they don't all have to be in air-conditioned places in town. We had air-conditioned places out in the desert out there for the hottest times with the inflatable structures and all during the Gulf War. And I would think it's something like that where you can even put up sand berms, or you have a perimeter that goes out a mile in each direction if you want to. I would think that's something we'd surely want to consider for the future over there, particularly in that area. But without asking for a response on that, I hope you're considering that. Mr. Secretary, in your statement on page 6 of your written statement, some focused on preventing an attack similar to the November bombing. Other actions focused on preventing attacks of a completely different nature and may have prevented a different type of attack from taking place. My assessment is that our commanders were trying to do right, but given the inconclusive nature of intelligence, had a difficult task to know what to plan for. We could push the perimeter out another 500 yards or half a mile, and you're still going to be subject to terrorist attacks. Chemical weapons can be manufactured by any well-organized terrorist group. Chemical weapons, as I understand it, we don't have a perfect inventory on those things. And it seems to me that being out of the urban area, out of the concentrated area, is your best defense against things like chemical attacks or BW attacks. You mentioned anthrax a little while ago. Having the perimeter back another 100 yards or so over there at the towers, the Khobar Towers, would not have prevented a tragedy from a chemical weapon that was spread upwind on a calm evening or something like that. Are you addressing those kinds of attacks in your assessment also, Mr. Secretary? And do all our services have instructions to consider their force protection, consider it not just a bomb that we know can blow up. We know that from World Trade Center, Oklahoma City, and Beirut and Riyadh, or Khobar, yet Riyadh. But we also have to prepare for CW, which may be even more easily brought into a compound or someplace than any high explosive weapon. Would you comment on that and what we're doing in that area?
In our consideration of attacks, we're looking at attacks with big bombs, little bombs, attacks on transportation and facilities, attacks on our food supply and water supply, chemical attacks, mortar attacks. All of these are ways to which we would be vulnerable. What we're doing specifically, and on nearly all of these, we've actually taken a number of very concrete actions. And that was what led me in my statement, that some of the actions we have taken, we have not seen the attack follow, and it could be because the action we took served to make that kind of an attack infeasible.
General Pay, would you comment on that?
Sir, we're looking at a full range of those things. Again, as you look across the 20 countries and the amount of urbanization, I think what we feel at this time, we need to see if we can't get our people into a place where we're just better protected, though, from some form of control or blast. But certainly the magnitude of what you're talking about makes this problem even more difficult. We're trying to address some priorities, but we're also trying not to turn around here in 3 or 4 years and say that, okay, we moved out there, but yet here's a whole different threat that we had to address.
Are there other threats that you're assessing also in addition to just our people there? For instance, we have a lot of Stinger missiles and things like that that are unaccounted for, and the Russian version of that, we've had thousands of those that are unaccounted for. They don't even keep them by serial number like we do. Those are all over the Mideast. I've been surprised somebody hadn't shot down an airplane over there with Stinger missiles as a troop transport or something comes in. Is that something we're also looking at?
Sir, we're discussing it. I think what you are correctly pointing out is what I have tried to say today, that in the Gulf, as different from the Middle East, there is a changing threat that now our country has got to come to grips with.
Yep. Well, I just say in closing, and my time is up, I know, or if it isn't, it's almost. I advocated keeping the same intelligence budget we had before, even increasing it, because I think our intelligence needs increased with the demise of the Soviet Union or the end of the Cold War. I think our needs increased instead of lessened. And if we ever do go back to war again, I hope it's a general all-out war. I hope it's with the best intelligence base and the best research base on which to build, those two things that I think we tend to cut back on in peacetime. That's absolutely the wrong moves to make. So best way to prevent these things is know about them in advance, and that's the toughest part of this thing. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, could I borrow 1 minute, just 1 minute here? I think it's very important that that this whole matter of force protection be put in perspective. There is no doubt that force protection is an extremely important part of any mission, and there's no doubt that that has to be one of the top priorities. And there's no doubt mistakes were made here and inevitably will be made again, particularly with the threats that Senator Glenn has talked about with chemical and biological. No perimeter is going to solve that problem. But it's also important to understand that when we have people all over the world, they're out there protecting our vital national security interest, and that force protection, as important as it is not the only mission. And I hope we don't come out of this hearing with the mentality that the only thing that a commander does in the field protecting our national interest is to protect the force. Because if that's the whole mission, then we will have a bunker mentality and we will not be able to protect America's national interest, and the largest superpower in the world will find itself immobilized. I also hope, and I think all the questions have been very appropriate this morning, but I hope we don't come to a conclusion that 0 casualties is possible in the military, or really, for that matter, in any kind of risky endeavor. It's just impossible. That doesn't mean we don't do everything possible to get better prepared and protect our people as well as they can possibly be protected. But if we adopt the attitude here in the committee and in the Congress that our goal realistically is zero casualties in the military, we'd have to stop training. We have hundreds of casualties, I don't have the numbers now, in all of our services in training and preparing for the worst possible contingencies so we lose less lives in the long run. Training accidents are going to happen. Casualties are going to happen in training, and we try to minimize those. But it's in the effort to train that we reduce overall casualties in conflict. So I hope we don't come or give the impression that we are beginning to move this country towards a zero casualty expectation. That will make it impossible for any military commander to be able to perform their job. So I hope that that message is clear. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, sir. Let's see, Senator Kempthorne.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. And may I say to the three gentlemen that I know that this has to be a difficult hearing for you because all of us mourn the loss of these Americans. And I appreciate your being here today. Mr. Secretary, let me reference General Pease' opening comments. He went into some detail about the complex operational environment by which we operate in Saudi Arabia, and he stressed that one of the things that we need is to understand the Saudi culture and the way of doing business. The general went on to say that what may appear as Saudi indifference or unwillingness is in fact a reflection of their different sense of time. Decisions at all levels of the Saudi government are slow by U.S. standards. In the questions that were directed at General P as to where the request came to extend the perimeter, General P made the point that had it reached him, he would have tried to deal with it at his level for several weeks, perhaps months, acknowledging the culture, I believe, of the Saudis. So, Mr. Secretary, my question to you is this: is the administration allowing the culture of another country to stand in the way of us protecting our American troops?
Senator Kempthorne, anytime we are guests in another country, hosted by that country, we have to pay very careful attention to their culture, their laws, but we also have to hold up a concept of force protection, a protection of our forces. And if those come in conflict, then we have to decide in favor of force protection. That
Mr. Secretary,
may mean
were we
dealing
not
with,
in conflict?
pardon me?
Were we not in conflict?
We were in conflict in this case, and therefore we have to address the conflict. The debate and the hearing here is whether we addressed it at the right level. I can assure you, had it been brought up to my level, I would have been prepared to have gone to the highest levels in the Saudi government to deal with this.
But, Mr. Secretary, in light of the fact that we had had a terrorist attack in Riyadh, the fact that we had threats, the fact that we know that there are different cultural differences with the Saudi government, in that atmosphere, is it appropriate for us to believe that all of this should have simply been handled by the military, or the fact that this called for diplomacy and others within the administration to clear the way for an atmosphere so that force structure could properly be addressed?
Senator Kempthorne, that's, I think, a very astute observation, and it guided my actions when I was in Saudi Arabia shortly after the bombing. And I focused on two what I would consider high-level. I dealt at the highest level of the Saudi government to make 2 points which I think determine the extent to which we can operate effectively in the future. One of them is that we had to have full cooperation on the investigation, and the other was that given the level of the threat we were now dealing with, that we had to be prepared to move some of our bases out of the urban area, and that we would require full cooperation with the Saudis on that. So we're already moving in that direction, these two areas, we have to deal with the highest levels of the Saudi government in order to establish the framework which would allow our lower level commanders to operate, and in particular do the rebasing that's going to be necessary.
Mr. Secretary, with all due respect, I believe that we subordinated our culture, which is to protect our troops, to the culture of the host country. And I think it cost us.
Senator Kempthorne, I can tell you that we never consciously decided to do that. Certainly I never did, and I do not believe any of our senior commanders ever did either.
General Shalikashvili, we've discussed at this hearing the fact that there has been a changed threat to our forces, that we now are dealing with terrorists. Does it suggest that we need to re-examine where we base our forces to carry out operations such as they're currently carrying out in Saudi Arabia offshore? Should these planes be aircraft carrier planes as opposed to on the land?
I think that in that particular region, we maintain for a considerable period of time each year aircraft carrier offshore in order to provide us the additional air power. I do not believe that on a day-to-day basis you would be able to sustain that. But we certainly need to do the rebasing that Secretary Perry talked about, and that was something under discussion before the Khobar bombing. I think we can put ourselves into a much more secure position than our forces are, for instance, in Riyadh. And that, in combination with retaining a periodic presence offshore with a carrier to provide us that added air power, as we do right now, I think is appropriate. But I don't believe you can have the flexibility of having the kind of support aircraft and all of that without tying up our aircraft assets and leaving us vulnerable in some other parts of the world.
All right. Secretary Perry, based on the information that you have to date, do you feel that there may be a connection between the terrorist attack in Riyadh and perhaps the subsequent execution of those terrorists and what took place at Khobar Towers?
To get a definitive answer to that question, we're going to have the investigation now underway completed. I would be happy in closed session to discuss with you my best judgment.
Can't hear you. Speak a little louder.
I said I would be happy to discuss in closed session my best judgment on that based on the investigation to date. But I can tell you that there's not a definitive answer to that question yet.
And Mr. Secretary, final question then. Do you feel that the administration is fully engaged with the Saudi government so that the requests such as by the FBI that they be included in both the investigation and all leads leading to the apprehension of these terrorists will be conducted in a coordinated fashion with the United States?
I believe that is the case. I have been assured by the King, and Director Free has been assured by the Minister of Interior that will be the case. We must insist on that.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, thank you.
Senator Rao.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, I must say that I have been frustrated sitting here for 3 hours listening to the testimony, not to the testimony you've given, but to the impression that I'm afraid may be left about where our military is today, where our intelligence community is today, and the implication, at least, of failure of either leadership or sound advice, good judgment, whatever the case may be. I'm quite prepared to ask tough questions, as I have in the past, and will continue to do so. And I think it's appropriate to respond to tough questions here today. I want to join very much in the general comments that were made by Senator Glenn and followed up on by Senator Nunn in terms of some of the things that we're not talking about today. I was going to ask some questions about nuclear, chemical, biological stingers were all on my list in terms of things not to discuss specifically, but in terms of the kinds of risks in unconventional warfare that we're not even talking about and yet still amount to a serious threat if we're talking about terrorist activities. It seems to me that we ought to acknowledge very openly that we're on the very front edge of a long, steep learning curve with respect to terrorist activities. And I think that you have implicitly, and in some cases explicitly, suggested that today. But I worry about the second-guessing, the Monday morning, whatever you want to call it, in terms of being able to discern exactly what a specific vulnerability was in a specific situation and draw broader conclusions about where we are based on that particular matter. I would urge colleagues who have not already done so to take advantage of intelligence briefings, to stay for the closed session, and to meet with Prince Bandar. I discussed the matter with him at some length yesterday. That's right. Senator Glenn and I met with him again this morning. I think he can provide useful information that addresses several of the questions that have been troubling senators, and if you have not already availed yourself of that, I suggest that you do. Let me ask a question that has not been formally presented but seems to me, let me make a point before I do, because General P, I feel very strongly about the point that you made with respect to allowing some latitude of judgment for command. With all due deference to colleagues, and I'll be a member of one if I have to, I think that if we take away that latitude, we are going to destroy the officer corps, the senior NCOs, and what we expect, and indeed what we, in effect, hire on people who serve in the military to do. And if we expect, and again, I don't mean to in any way diminish the very serious question that was presented, but if in a broader sense, if all the tough questions are immediately kicked all the way up the line, we're eating away at almost everything that our traditional force structure, not only in the military, but throughout the rest of society stands for, and I think it would be a serious mistake. So I would ask you to hold your ground, be ambivalent about whether or not you would do something in this particular case because of the seriousness of the question, but don't suggest that that's standard operating procedure for any question that seems to be a little bit difficult or will begin a cancer. Let me ask you to comment on the question of trade-offs, if you will. Not explicitly stated, but implicit is a trade-off between security risks and quality of life, livability. And in many instances, we're talking about whether or not you put people in a buttoned-up atmosphere, whether you put them in flak jackets, whether you put CW gear, whether you put them in gas masks, whether you require them to sit in the cockpits, whether you require them to go through trenches to get back and forth, or whether you assume that there's some level of risk that is necessary and acceptable, not just going to the point that Senator Nunn made in terms of what are we putting people in harm's way in the first place for, but in terms of how we get by to day. How likely is it that a threat is more important than the kind of morale problems you'll have if you stick everybody in an unair-conditioned facility when you know there's something else there? Would you discuss that just a little bit in terms of the kinds of choices that you're making so we don't look at this entirely in a black and white situation and suggest that we only go for the most secure environment in which our force protection can be administered?
Let me comment on that, and then maybe General Shelley or General P would like to add to it. I want to say as strongly as I know how to that this threat of terrorism is very serious. We will face it again. We may face it again soon. We may face it in Saudi Arabia. We may face it in other countries in the Gulf, and we should understand that that's what we're up against. Big bombs are only one aspect of the threat and not necessarily the most difficult aspect. We have the threat of chemical warheads, the threat of Stinger missiles, the threat of mortar attacks. All of these are components of the threat. Most of the questions today have focused on this one aspect, And we have to understand that our problem preparing for this threat is much more complex than that. And I do want to tie on to Senator Nunn's point with dealing with that while we're trying to carry out our mission, which is why we're over there in the first place. Now, if the mission is important, and I believe, as I've testified, that it is, in the face of the kind of threats we're talking about, and understanding we do not want to have our soldiers living in bunkers 24 hours a day, we are going to have to rethink how we do the mission in rather fundamental ways. It is not just a matter of moving the fence out another few hundred feet. It is not just a matter of putting Mylar in the windows. Those things can be done and should be done short term. But we have to consider a very significant change in our basing altogether if we're going to stay there and do that mission. That's going to be difficult, it's going to be expensive, it's going to be complex. But I believe that mission is important, and I believe that in order to carry it out, we have to make very fundamental changes in basing, not just because of the big bombs, but in particular because of the big bomb threat. Maybe General Shelley or General Pete would want to add to that.
The only thing I would add is that it is so correct that we are there wherever we go to execute our mission, and so there's a limit on what we can ask our people to do, and they still remain 100% up to do the mission. Because everything we put on them, or much of what we put on them for force protection, detracts from their ability to do their mission, to be sharp, to be ready to go mentally, physically. And so we need to balance those things. And in a place like Bosnia, we can afford to do certain things, and we are required to do certain things. When you have a terrorist threat in the middle of Germany, as we did during Desert Storm, you are limited to what you can do. And when you're in a place like Riyadh, you again have limitations on what can be done. I'm also mindful that we are asking men and women to be in the armed forces, not just for that 3 weeks or 3 months that we ask them to deploy to Saudi Arabia, but when you go to Saudi Arabia, you find that some of these people are there on the 4th, 5th, or 6th time around. And so for them, this is a way of life. And when AWACS crews are not in Saudi Arabia, you will find them in some other place where they have to worry about force protection. So we need to be mindful of those requirements to balance a quality of life for them and their families, for them to be mentally alert to do the mission first, and also, of course, to provide the force protection. I think we have done very well. It has never been 100% an all or nothing issue, but I think on balance, when I look at what armed forces have done for the last, I don't know how many years in that area, by and large, we have done that balancing act very, very well. And I think that here in Saudi, where we are now facing a much more difficult challenge, we too will find the right balance between moving out of urban areas, between making sure that we have people there we need to have there, and that gets at some difficult issues as contractors and others that we need to take a look at. But I believe that we will find the right balance. We have done so in the past, and I think we will do that here.
Sir, I agree with all of that. Again, I go back to my earlier comments that in addition to what we call combatant troops, which frankly, they'll be the easiest ones to secure, we'll be able to move those units out in their totality and keep them together cohesively. It's all the non-combatants that are there. Senator Nunn mentioned earlier today about trying to get these countries to start to take on more of their defense. We have 1,500 advisors that are spread out all over Saudi Arabia in various urbanized towns where they are side by side with their Saudi counterparts as we try to improve their performance so that we can wean our way out of all of that. So I believe in balance as we work through this. I would be unfair as a commander that's interested in obviously the readiness of the total force that the chiefs of our service have to provide. I've got to tell you, when you start to move organizations, though, it's going to cost money. And that's going to be a consideration as we go down this road.
Fortunately, the host nation in this case understands the responsibilities of burden sharing, and I've already had a discussion on that, so at least we'll have cooperation, as the Secretary has noted. Mr. Chairman, could I ask one exit question that they can probably answer with a yes or no after
Go ahead.
3 hours? Gentlemen, is there anything that you have discovered to date that, based on the examination of the facts, not based on the fact that we had the specific terrorist incident that occurred, but based on the general readiness that you would clearly have done differently or clearly represents, in your judgment, a failure to take appropriate action absent the higher indication of this particular threat or any other threat? In other words, is there anything that you can cite to date that would reflect the kind of error that would be culpable and that we ought to be very much concerned about, putting aside the terrible tragedy that occurred with this particular munition?
With all respect, Senator Robb, that question is so portentous that I want to defer my answer to it until I get General Downing's report. He is looking precisely at that question, and any question that involves culpability I want to be very well informed and very well researched before I answer it.
I think that's a responsible answer, and I won't even ask the other generals to comment on that under the circumstances. Mr. Chairman, I thank you.
Thank you. The first round is now over. The committee will now move to room S407 for an executive and classified session on this matter. The committee will confer an executive session with the ambassador from Saudi Arabia and then continue with testimony from defense officials in classified session.
Get out of the car.